takes a couple of attempts, but you manage to spark up a lighter and hold it up steadily in front of your face to light up a joint. A familiar woody smell fills the room and drifts out of your window on the afternoon breeze. You blink, steady yourself, inhale deeply, and fill your lungs up with warmth. But what happens next? Chemically speaking, biologically speaking, what is it about this little green plant that gets millions of people around the world to flock to it? How long has humanity been consuming it? And what exactly is it doing inside your body, inside your mind? To start, let's have a look at the chemical composition of the cannabis plant itself, rolled up in a joint in your hand. Native to Central and South Asia, the cannabis plant today is so popular, it's now grown to be a global economy of its own. From small-scale rural farming operations all the way through to drug super labs, including any number of illegal weed farms somewhere in the middle. Experts believe that there are well over 700 different strains of cannabis currently on the market, and this number seems only set to increase. Being able to identify which strain of weed you have in your hand can be very easy when buying from a legal dispensary, but if you live in a country or a state where marijuana is still criminalized, being able to verify exactly what it is you're smoking becomes more difficult. Looking down at the green mossy balls in your hand, do you know where in the world it's come from and what's inside it? Let's break it down a bit, or rather, grind it down. You've likely heard of the two most well-known active ingredients in cannabis. These are cannabidiol and tetrahydrocannabinol, or as you probably know them, CBD and THC. Over the last 10 years in the West in particular, CBD has been championed as a potential medical breakthrough. It's also been shown to have a calming effect on those with anxious disorders and is currently being tested as a treatment for psychosis, sleep disorders, muscle spasticity, and more. You might have seen ads for CBD oil products popping up in your feed claiming that it can solve any number of ailments. Research is ongoing, however, results vary. In the case of curing cancer, for example, so far there's no evidence to support that CBD has any kind of effect on the disease, despite what people on the internet might be saying. So, you smoke CBD to get high, right? No, CBD is usually extracted as an oil, and on its own it will not get you high. But it's still psychoactive, meaning it alters your mental state, typically leaving you feeling more calm and mellow. The feeling of being high comes from the main active component in marijuana, THC. Typically found in much greater quantities than CBD, THC can have a powerful psychoactive effect. To see what that means in practice, let's follow it as it enters the human body. You take in a deep breath of that joint and let the smoke fill your lungs. In this example, you're going to be our test subject, and you will be smoking weed. Smoking is one of the most direct and quickest ways to get high. This is because the smoke from your burning marijuana contains high levels of THC. The smoke is then inhaled, filling your lungs. At this point, you might experience some irritation, manifesting in the iconic smoker's cough from introducing an alien substance into your lungs. This, however, is not unique to smoking weed, as you're likely to see the same from people smoking or vaping conventional tobacco. The lungs are designed to quickly and efficiently transfer oxygen into the bloodstream when we breathe. Therefore, they have the capacity to take in large quantities of gas in one breath and get any number of elements or compounds from that gas into our bloodstream, and fast. The lungs aren't just empty chambers, they're full of tiny little air pockets called alveoli. The average human adult has roughly 480 million alveoli in their lungs, constituting about 1,500 miles of airways. That's the equivalent of driving from Miami to New Hampshire for our American viewers, or Madrid to Copenhagen for our European viewers. For everyone else, it's roughly 13,636,363.6 bananas lying end to end. Anyway, back to your lungs. In each alveolus, the THC from the smoke is transferred directly into your bloodstream, which then carries it all over your body, including to the critical area, your brain. As a result, it often only takes a matter of seconds for the user to start feeling the psychoactive effects of what they're smoking. So, let's crack your head open and see what's going on inside. Sorry, this might hurt a little. The THC and CBD bind themselves to receptors throughout your brain. The amygdala, for example, is responsible for anxiety, emotional responses, and fear. CBD dulls the activity in this part of the brain, but the THC component can stimulate it. While many users feel calmer after having smoked weed, others can feel a heightened sense of paranoia and worry, particularly on the come down as the calming effects of the CBD wear off. Looking at other parts of the brain impacted by the CBD, we have the basal ganglia, which is involved with motor control and planning, the neocortex, which processes sensory information, and the cerebellum, which is the center of motor control. All three of these areas are impacted by smoking weed, resulting in you feeling slower in general. Reflexes are delayed, information takes more time to process, and motor functions and speech slow down. Driving under the influence of marijuana can be very dangerous as a result. One study in the UK found that fatal accidents are 1.65 times more likely to occur when the subject is under the influence of marijuana, while another study in Canada found that accidents could be 2 to 4 times as likely. Most countries have strict laws for driving under the influence of weed, with zero-tolerance policies, made stricter by the fact that it can take over 48 hours for weed to stop showing up on a blood test. If they're testing your saliva, it can be up to 72 hours. Urine can be anywhere from 3 to 30 days, and it can even be tested in your hair follicles for up to 90 days. Fortunately, you won't find many traffic cops that are plucking out your arm hair for a routine traffic stop. However, it would be reductive to think that all weed does is dull your brain. THC is a very active component that stimulates a lot of neural activity. Colors look brighter, sounds are louder, music sounds more rich and layered. Food often tastes better under the influence of THC, giving the subject the illusion that they're really hungry. That's right, this is why so many people using cannabis experience the famous munchies, which is why having a stoner visit your home is potentially extremely dangerous to the state of your snack pantry and chip supply. Many people report having heightened imagination, being able to think outside the box or come up with fresh and exciting ideas. Artists all throughout history have partaken in recreational drugs in an attempt to broaden their horizons, dulling a lot of the negative sensations, such as feeling pain and anxiety, coupled with the stimulation from THC, results in feelings of euphoria. In short, you, our human test subject, have gotten high. But what does this high actually look like? Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's bandage your head up and take a look. So far, we've only focused on the THC and CBD, but there are hundreds of active components within cannabis, which vary in quantity and intensity depending on which of the hundreds of strains the user is consuming. On top of that, there's the method of consumption. While smoking or vaping gets the chemicals into the bloodstream quickly, the high only lasts around 3 hours or so. Many users instead take gummies or bake brownies and cookies. When weed is absorbed through the digestive system, it takes a significantly longer time to kick in, but when it does, the user can experience highs that go on for hours, even up to a day, as the digestive system slowly releases the chemicals into the bloodstream. All of this makes studying the effects of marijuana very difficult. As with almost any study, there are the caveats of which strain is being used, how the test subject is ingesting it, and who the test subject is. The human brain is an incredibly complex thing indeed. If you took a sample of the human brain that was the size of just 1 grain of sand, that sample would contain 100,000 neurons and 1 billion synapses. Now multiply that by 860,000 and you've got a human brain, just like the one that's sitting in your head, watching this video and feeling very smug about itself. Being able to quantify and measure exactly what's happening in an organ far more advanced and complicated than the computers we're studying it on has been a challenge in medical science for decades and will likely continue to be one for a very long time. While one individual might take 1 puff and spend the rest of the day feeling anxious, their elderly grandma might smoke a whole bowl and feel nothing but zen. So, for Nana's sake, is it dangerous? Well, on the whole, consuming marijuana is relatively harmless as long as you aren't driving, controlling heavy machinery, or performing open-heart surgery. The risks of smoking the occasional joint with the right amount of weed in it are low. So, why hasn't it been legalized worldwide already? And why are there skeptics out there, including in the scientific community? As is often the case with controversial topics, a lot of the conflict comes from political and cultural differences. To tell that whole story, we need to wind all the way back to China in 2800 BC, where we find the first recorded use of marijuana in history. Even that long ago, the cannabis plant was being used for medicinal purposes. Emperor Shen Nong, considered by many to be the grandfather of medicine, recorded the plant in his writings as being particularly useful. From that point, records of cannabis spread throughout India, Syria, Greece, and Rome. Various healing properties have been ascribed to it over the years, including cures for inflammation, depression, arthritis, and even asthma. Of course, most early medicine is notoriously rather unreliable. We're looking at you, leeches and milk transfusions. But there's always been something about this little green plant that's captured the attention of doctors and pharmacologists throughout the centuries. Often there's a grain of truth to the mythology that has sprung up around the drug. In Hinduism, for example, the god Shiva is given the title of Lord of Bhang because cannabis is his favorite food. For centuries, many Hindus believed that if you were suffering from a fever, it was the god's hot breath of anger upon you. Rituals were conducted where you would be given a quantity of cannabis to consume so you would find favor with Shiva again, and your fever would pass. With modern medical science, we know that THC acts in the hypothalamus of the brain, reducing the body's temperature and therefore counteracting fevers. So, where did it all go wrong for weed's PR team? Why is it that many people in the West now include cannabis in the same conversation as crack, cocaine, and heroin, as opposed to paracetamol and penicillin? Well, medical marijuana was first introduced in the West in 1841 by William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, an Irish physician who spent years studying all kinds of different medicines in India. But the real origins of the USA's problem with marijuana began 200 years before that, in the Jamestown colony in 1605. Dissatisfied with the return on investment they were seeing, the English, and King James I in particular, demanded the colony change up the crop they produced to hemp, a plant within the cannabis family. The crop was a massive success and became the key to the early expansion of the American colonial settlements. George Washington himself famously grew hemp as one of his 3 primary crops on Mount Vernon. The plant was used to manufacture ropes and fabrics, but following William Brooke O'Shaughnessy's findings from India, Americans began to experiment with the plant's medicinal properties. The USA was still in relative infancy, with many laws and prohibitions being established. Drug laws at the time involved labeling products as being poisons, which restricted them to being legal only if prescribed by a pharmacist. Even then, the debate about cannabis varied from state to state, with some issuing it with the poison status and others believing it was exempt from these rules. At the time, opium dens were rife across America, and alongside them a number of hashish parlors popped up in which people would smoke various forms of hemp and cannabis. By 1880, these establishments were seen as quite fashionable, with many of the upper classes frequenting them. It's estimated that there were roughly 500 such parlors in New York City alone. The laws needed to be strengthened further still. Fraud and corruption were rife in the drug industry, with many falsely labeling their products for the sake of profit. The tighter that these restrictions got, the more people looked for loopholes. The government and the newly established Food and Drug Administration were pulling in different directions than a lot of the American public, who were looking to skirt prescriptions and drug laws in order to continue to get their highs. In the move to close the loopholes, cannabis was often grouped in with many of the much more addictive, much more harmful drugs that were plaguing the American population. The solution the American government came to was a zero-tolerance policy on recreational drug use, including the prohibition of alcohol and the criminalization of marijuana, which at the time they were spelling with an H. In 1971, President Nixon coined the term war on drugs, where he declared drug abuse to be public enemy number 1 of the American people. The approach was incarceration with an iron fist. Possession, distribution, and consumption of banned substances would result in jail time. It's estimated that throughout this war on drugs, the USA spends roughly $51 billion annually on its endeavor to clean up the streets. To illustrate, with that money, the USA could give each Canadian citizen $1,416.67 per year just as a little thank you for being such lovely neighbors. Alternatively, they could give one lucky Canadian $1 a minute for 97,032 years. A large amount of this campaign against drugs has involved a level of fear-mongering. There's a lot of false information swirling around the world about the negative effects these drugs have. It rots the brain and causes psychosis. It's a gateway drug to stronger and more dangerous highs, and it is highly addictive. But is there any truth to any of these claims? Let's examine them one by one. Firstly, no, marijuana does not rot the brain. Rotting is the decay of dead organic material as bacteria and fungi consume it. That simply doesn't happen. However, the link to psychosis is a much more contested field, with evidence for both sides of the argument. Firstly, what is psychosis? It's a term that is thrown around a lot, especially in the world of drug use, but very rarely defined, meaning a lot of people attach their own fears, worries, and prejudices to the word. Psychosis is when someone loses contact with reality. The image of the world around them that the brain is painting doesn't match up with the objective reality surrounding them. The two main symptoms of psychosis are hallucinations and delusions, and it's important to know the difference between the two. A hallucination is when a person experiences something that isn't actually happening. Most commonly, this takes the form of hearing voices that aren't really there, or sometimes seeing things that aren't really there. In some cases, people have reported smelling, feeling, and tasting their hallucinations too, such as tasting blood in their mouth despite there being none. A delusion, on the other hand, is more abstract. It could be the feeling that you're being followed, or that there's a conspiracy in your workplace to harm you. Delusional people are often highly susceptible to conspiracy theories, as often the paranoid messaging chimes with their fearful delusions that their minds have already been generating. So, does marijuana cause psychosis? It's complicated. Let's go back to the chemicals active in your brain. We're gonna need to crack that skull open again, sorry. THC is highly psychoactive. This is where the feeling of euphoria from being high comes from. While CBD can decrease the levels of panic and paranoia in the brain, it's often present in much smaller quantities than THC, mainly as many cannabis farms compete with one another to grow stronger and stronger strains. Couple that with the fact that there are hundreds of active compounds within the cannabis plant, and it goes back to our earlier point about this being a challenging area of study. Therefore, many scientists rely on quite broad studies, taking large sample sizes of drug users and non-drug users and comparing the development of their brains over time, looking most notably at teenagers and young people. What they found is there is often a link between heavy pot smoking and psychosis. There are cases of people living with schizophrenia and bipolar disorders where the heavy use of marijuana is linked to the onset of those symptoms. What has not been proven, however, is that weed was the cause. Most scientists believe that weed can, in some cases, accelerate the development of underlying psychotic disorders. The brain is a very complex and delicate thing. If somebody has an underlying psychotic condition, then the consumption of drugs that alters their state of mind and heightens activities within certain sections of the brain can naturally lead to an exacerbation of those symptoms. Schizophrenia is believed to affect 1 in 300 people, while bipolar disorder affects 1 in 100. While these are quite small percentages, they are not insignificant. THC does carry the risk of triggering a psychotic episode if you're genetically predisposed to having a psychotic condition. The chances are very low and won't affect the majority of the population, but they are still there. Next, is it a gateway drug? The experience of a chemical buzz in the brain is a sensation that many of us try to chase in our lives. You get up and sing in a concert at your high school and you get a rush from it. You do it a second time and the high is worn off a bit. So you need a bigger crowd, and suddenly you're in a rock band on an arena tour. Chasing this type of bigger, better high is an experience we're sure many of you are familiar with. Studies have shown that in a minority of cases, the same can happen with marijuana. Usage of the drug can prime the brain, ready for more intense highs, which it then craves. This sounds bad until you realize the same thing happens with cigarettes and alcohol. Both of these demonstrate a similar connection to being a gateway drug to harder substances as marijuana. So why are those not held up to the same level of scrutiny? One thing studies have shown is that there is a much more powerful gateway drug out there: trauma. A difficult childhood, experiencing abuse, and going through acute pain and suffering are all far more likely to result in a person developing a dependence on hard substances. Weed is often a part of that journey, but in these cases it seems to be a symptom more than the cause of the problem. But is it addictive? Let's take a similar look at this question. You wake up one morning feeling tired, so you make yourself a cup of coffee. It clears away the fog, helps you focus on your job, and gives you a little endorphin rush from a good day's work. So the next day, you do the same, and the next, until one day you run out of coffee. You look in the jar and it's empty. A storm cloud gathers over your head. You go to work with a scowl, snap at your coworkers, have a headache by lunchtime, and come home feeling miserable. What's happened here? Well, the human brain is incredibly flexible. Your brain has gotten so used to the influx of caffeine each day that it's now rebalanced the chemicals inside itself to receive that caffeine boost. It's ready and it's waiting, so when the boost doesn't come, there's now a chemical imbalance. The same thing happens with weed. If you burn one down at 420, smoke weed every day, your brain's going to be sitting there at 419 rubbing its metaphorical hands together in anticipation. Coming off weed now feels hard. You have cravings for it, you feel irritated when you don't have it, you struggle to fall asleep, you lose your appetite, and you generally have a bad time. For about 2 weeks. Then you're likely back to normal. That's because what we've described here isn't an addiction, it's dependence. It's very common and can be broken fairly quickly. Up to 30% of weed smokers experience some level of dependence, and it can be overcome by just taking an extended break and giving your brain some rest. That said, there's a small risk of long-term addiction. People under the age of 18 have brains that are still developing. They're still growing and changing and adjusting to the world around them. Smoking weed regularly at this stage in your life could lead your brain to building itself around the expectation that it'll be receiving those chemical hits every day, which may start as a dependence and could grow to be much more deeply rooted and could result in a lifelong addiction. If there's one thing you learned from this video, it's that marijuana, much like life, is complicated. There may not always be a straight answer to every question. Anyone who tells you that something is totally amazing and has no downsides will always be lying. Even ice cream has downsides. What's important is looking at the big picture. Is weed the devil's leaf that spells the end of society as we know it? No, of course not. But neither is it a miracle cure-all drug that everyone should take on a daily basis.
56 to 43% in support of the ballot initiative. There are various parts to this plant, so let's take a look. Marijuana actually refers to the flower that buds on the plant. This is dried and cured from the female cannabis plants and often smoked to bring on the effects of the drug. Then there's the kief, which refers to the sticky pollen glands, which contains the terpenes that make cannabis have its unique smell, as well as cannabinoids such as tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, which interact with different receptors in the body to produce a wide range of effects such as feeling high. There's also hashish, which is made by compressing the cannabinoid-rich resin of the marijuana plant to produce a brown, solid substance. Tinctures are liquid concentrates made through alcohol extraction. This extracts many of the plant's beneficial cannabinoids, often used for medical purposes. And finally, hash oil, which can be created using a variety of solvents like butane to extract the resinous material from the marijuana plant's flowers. In terms of usage, a Yahoo News Maris survey reported in 2017 that approximately 35 million Americans use marijuana on a monthly basis. At least 78 million surveyed reported having tried the substance at some point in their lives, and 55 million residents reported using marijuana within the past year. So how safe is it to regularly take the drug, and are there any risks of overdose? The effects of smoking marijuana are usually felt almost immediately and can last from 1 to 3 hours, while effects from eating or drinking can last for several hours but take longer to take hold. Common effects of marijuana intoxication include relaxation, sleepiness, euphoria, dry mouth, impaired perception, red eyes, and increased appetite, which users commonly refer to as the munchies, where they often crave higher doses of sugary foods like candies and chocolate. Okay, that all sounds quite pleasant, but what if you take too much of this mind-altering herb? If large quantities of the drug are taken, or if the user is inexperienced and not used to the effects, there can be some unpleasant side effects such as panic, paranoia, acute psychosis, nausea, and shortness of breath. But negative effects of marijuana usually subside on their own and don't typically require medical care, and the chances of overdose on marijuana are extremely small. So can you actually overdose to the point of death? From our research, it seems to be widely considered impossible to actually die from a marijuana overdose. One reason is because the cannabinoid receptors in the brain aren't located in the brain stem and don't control any essential functions, unlike most depressants and stimulants. We could not find any officially recorded instances of people dying from a fatal dose of marijuana alone. There was a case that hit headlines in 2017, which included the seizure and death of an 11-month-old baby after exposure to cannabis. Many media outlets reported this as the first marijuana overdose death. But Thomas Knapp, an author of the report who is now the director of medical toxicology at St. Luke's University Health Network in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, was quoted later as saying, "We are absolutely not saying that marijuana killed that child." According to the Huffington Post, in 1988, a DEA judge argued in favor of rescheduling marijuana because of its low harm profile. In his ruling, he explained that a user would have to ingest somewhere between 20,000 to 40,000 times the amount of THC that is found in a single marijuana joint to approach a lethal dose. A smoker would theoretically have to consume nearly 1,500 pounds of marijuana within about 15 minutes to induce a lethal response, wrote Judge Francis Young. So it certainly seems the jury is out on this one, and though you can overdose on weed to a point of serious and unpleasant side effects, it's highly unlikely you can die from this drug when taken on its own.
May 16, 2002, Scottsdale, Arizona. 34-year-old Sean Atwood was working from home making trades on the stock market online when a 20-member SWAT team suddenly burst into his apartment. Wielding guns, the police yelled at Atwood to get down on the floor. He was handcuffed and arrested, charged with money laundering and conspiracy. Ironically, Atwood, persuaded by his girlfriend, had already given up his wild life as Arizona's biggest ecstasy kingpin and settled down to domestic bliss. In fact, Atwood thought he had gotten away with it all. Sean Atwood was born to Derek and Barbara Atwood on October 28, 1968. He grew up in Widnes, a small chemical manufacturing town near Liverpool in northwest England. His loving parents encouraged him to excel at school, and he did. As a teen, Atwood became interested in the stock market. With some books and the help of his economics teacher, Atwood began to learn about stocks. Soon, he was reading the Financial Times. By age 16, Atwood had made his first trade, ending up doubling the pocket money given to him by his grandmother. A few times, teenage Atwood visited his expat aunts who lived in Arizona. He found America dazzling, from the hot desert sun to the wide open space and swimming pools. He considered the U.S. a promised land where anyone could make it. In 1987, after graduating high school and completing A-levels in maths, physics, and economics, Atwood enrolled in the University of Liverpool. At the time, a rave scene was sweeping across the UK. Invited by a classmate for a night out at the Thunderdome Club in Manchester, shy, anxiety-ridden Atwood tried ecstasy and speed for the first time. He loved how the drugs made him feel. With newfound confidence fueled by his high, he was able to talk to anyone. Atwood was quickly sucked into the rave scene, spending each weekend partying. Despite his wild social life, he graduated with first-class honors and a business studies degree. He sought a job in London but was unable to find one. In the summer of 1990, Atwood flew out to Arizona. He didn't have authorization to work in the US. However, an aunt worked in the fraud detection business and knew exactly how to help him make a convincing fake H-1B work visa. Atwood got a job as a commission-only stockbroker. He lived cheaply and worked hard, cold calling 500 numbers a day. 5 years later, Atwood was a top earner with a salary of over $500,000 a year and his own secretary and cold callers. But the long hours and stressful job took a toll on Atwood. He had BOBS, burnt-out broker syndrome. Atwood began blowing off steam by throwing parties on the weekends. Wanting to be known as a big spender, he started buying 50 ecstasy pills at a time from a local dealer and giving them away to friends. In the mid-90s, ecstasy in the US was expensive. It could run $30 a hit. Atwood became committed to importing the UK rave scene to Arizona. Eventually, the hectic double life became too much for Atwood. In 1997, he quit his stockbroking day job and invested his substantial savings into technology shares. As the dot-com bubble grew, Atwood's portfolio became worth around $2 million. By this time, Atwood was throwing raves in the desert, in apartments, and in a warehouse in West Phoenix, wherever he could set up. However, he had trouble with getting a steady quality supply of drugs. Frustrated with his small-time local dealer, Atwood went to Los Angeles to purchase from someone higher up on the chain. He came back with 1,000 pills. Atwood became a full-time ecstasy dealer, buying tablets for around $10 each and selling them for between $25 and $30 a pop. One night, Atwood gained protection from the New Mexican Mafia by accident. Atwood was hosting a house party. The crowd was mostly college-age partiers, however, one guy stood out. A tough Mexican with huge tatted-up arms. He was there to deal cocaine, crystal meth, and weed. Since Atwood only sold ecstasy, he didn't see the other dealer as competition. The pair started chatting and the dealer introduced himself as G-Dog. Suddenly, a policeman arrived. After smelling weed, the policeman pulled out a gun and aimed it at the partiers, shouting for no one to leave. G-Dog pulled out his gun, pointed it at the cop, and said, "The only one who isn't going to leave is you, motherf." The crowd scattered. Atwood and his friends hid in another apartment. The police began going door to door in the complex as helicopters shone down spotlights. There was a sudden pounding on the French window at the back of the apartment, and they assumed it was the cops, but it was G-Dog asking for shelter. Atwood agreed, and the group spent the rest of the night silently hiding in the apartment in the dark. Sometime later, the police knocked at the door, but they eventually left after there was no response. The next morning, Atwood drove G-Dog home, and thanks for hiding him, G-Dog pledged that he and his brothers would have Atwood's back. At first, Atwood had no idea what this meant. A few months later, G-Dog invited Atwood to come meet his brothers. Atwood found himself at a New Mexican Mafia hangout, full of guys in sagging pants, chains, and tattoos. A TV showed CCTV footage of the surrounding area. Next to it was the biggest TV Atwood had ever seen. On top of the huge TV, the gang displayed their rocket-propelled grenade launcher. Atwood was terrified, but relaxed when the group joked with him and offered him protection. The rave scene in Arizona was growing. Atwood expanded his drug dealing business. He sold mainly ecstasy, but also Special K and LSD. He began ordering several thousand ecstasy tablets at a time from his LA connection. He hired a team of people to work for him and paid them in cash, cars, and apartments. Eventually, Atwood wanted to bypass his dealer in LA and purchase straight from the source. He found out that the ecstasy was being made some 5,000 miles away in Amsterdam, Holland. With his fraudulent visa, Atwood realized he couldn't leave the US, so he sent some of his employees to Europe on fact-finding missions. Happy with the samples they brought back, Atwood began testing different methods of smuggling the drugs. At first, Atwood's mules only carried around 5,000 pills at a time, but as they became more confident, they smuggled up to 40,000 pills per mission. Mainly, his employees would go to Germany or France and then take the train to Amsterdam. They would fly back to North America via Mexico and then smuggle the drugs over the US border. The drugs were hidden in luggage, computer towers, or vitamin bottles. Atwood imported ecstasy at $3 a pill from Holland and sold it for $10 a pill to his team of sellers. By 1999, Atwood had amassed a drug-dealing empire. Hundreds of people worked for him. He was the biggest ecstasy dealer in Arizona. Atwood became nicknamed the Bank of England because he had so much money. He was also dubbed the Wolf of Widnes, a play on the Wolf of Wall Street. Atwood's main enforcers were his childhood pal Wildman and his New Mexican Mafia buddy G-Dog. To support his operation, Atwood came up with an elaborate money laundering system, flying old friends over from Witness to the US to set up bank accounts, which he then used for illegal activities. At the height of his operation, Atwood had his own rave clothing line, a music store, and a personal LSD chemist. He lived among the very rich in an opulent mountainside mansion with his third wife, a topless dancer and internet porn star. He traveled by limo and acquired several luxury apartments, one of which was just to store his ill-gotten gains. Atwood was taking drugs as well as selling them. He took upwards of 10 ecstasy pills every weekend, as well as GHB, crystal meth, Valium, Xanax, and ketamine. Atwood's chaotic life was peppered with extreme moments of paranoia. It wasn't just the drugs. Salvatore Gravano, aka Sammy the Bull, a former henchman for the Gambino crime family who had once testified against John Gotti, set up a rival ecstasy distribution ring. Sammy took a hit out on Atwood and once plotted to kidnap him from a nightclub, but Atwood managed to foil his plans. In late 2000, the dot-com bubble burst and Atwood's stocks lost most of their value. Meanwhile, Atwood struggled to maintain order among his crew, quite often playing referee to their squabbles. Most of his squad was doing so much crystal meth they were growing reckless, paranoid, and plotting against each other. A few of his employees were caught smuggling drugs at airports around the world. Eventually, Atwood fell in love. His new girlfriend Claudia, who wasn't into the rave scene, convinced him to stop his wild ways. Tired of the havoc, Atwood began to wind down his partying and slow his drug use. Furthermore, Atwood stopped dealing and tried to rid himself of his connections to his ecstasy empire. He moved in with Claudia and began to improve his life, but it was too late. For the last 5 years, Atwood had been under federal investigation, complete with undercover cops following him and thousands of wiretaps. The DEA, U.S. Customs, and 3 Arizona police forces created a joint task force to bring Atwood down. Furthermore, the police were able to get 10 witnesses to come forward to testify against Atwood. On a quiet spring day in 2002, the police finally arrested Atwood. Naively, Atwood thought he had to be caught red-handed with drugs in order to get arrested. Per Arizonian laws, the police had 7 years to convict for any drug offense committed, and they do not require physical evidence of the drugs themselves. All of Atwood's assets were seized by the state of Arizona. Atwood was remanded to the notoriously tough Maricopa County Jail, run by controversial Sheriff Joe Arpaio. For the next 26 months, he lived in a tiny maximum security cell with 2 steel bunks and a seatless toilet. Atwood struggled to survive the brutal conditions at the jail, including extreme heat, cockroaches, rotten food, violent inmates, and murderous guards. Drug smuggling was common, with many prisoners addicted to crystal meth or heroin. Stabbings, assault, and rape were frequent. Gangs had more control over the jail than the guards did. To deal with stress, Atwood began keeping a journal. On bits of paper, he wrote entries using a golf pencil sharpened on his cell door. His aunt visited him frequently, and she would smuggle out his writings. She would then type them up and email them to Atwood's parents. Atwood's father, Derek, created a blog called John's Jail Journal and would post entries there. He kept the blog anonymous since Atwood feared reprisal from the guards. Eventually, the popular blog began to draw media interest worldwide as the dangerous conditions at Maricopa County Jail were exposed. After serving over 2 years prior to sentencing, Atwood signed a plea bargain admitting guilt for drug dealing and money laundering. He was sentenced to 9.5 years, thereby avoiding a maximum 200-year jail sentence if his case had gone to trial. In July of 2004, Atwood was moved to the Arizona Department of Corrections to serve out his time. His living conditions improved, although the prisoners were just as violent and dangerous as the ones he left behind. Atwood continued to write John's Jail Journal blog entries for now, more about the unique, colorful prisoners he met rather than his living conditions. In prison, Atwood attended therapy and read voraciously, starting with classic literature. He studied psychology and philosophy to help him better understand himself and his life choices. Atwood claims he read around 1,000 books in just over 6 years. Atwood was released in December of 2007 after having served about 6 years of his sentence. He was deported to the UK and banned from the US for life. Temporarily, Atwood moved back in with his parents and initially struggled to adjust to life post-prison. Cocaine was trendy in the UK, and various connections kept calling Atwood asking for his help in establishing a cocaine import business to the UK. Atwood continued to write and in 2008 won a short story competition with an entry about prison life. As a result of his win, Atwood was assigned an author to mentor him. Several months later, Atwood received a publishing deal for his first book, which was about his experience in America's toughest jail.
Since then, Sean Atwood has published several books about drugs and the prison system, including 2 more books regarding his wild life of drug dealing and subsequent punishment. He continues to update John's jail blog, publishing letters he's received from prisoners. He also campaigns for humane jail conditions. In addition to being an author, Atwood is a speaker who's given TED Talks and also has spoken to school children across the UK and Europe about drugs and the consequences of his lifestyle. He hopes to prevent youths from making the same mistakes he did. Atwood feels the speeches he makes and the guidance he offers atones for his former life more than the incarceration sentence he served.
Nose candy? Snow? Blow? This powder is so ancient that scientists have found traces of it in millennia-old mummies. It even used to be a common ingredient in over-the-counter medicine. But now it's worth billions on the black market and is responsible for thousands of overdoses every year. It could only be cocaine. Cocaine is one of the most popular recreational drugs, but like with a lot of illegal substances, it can be hard to get straight answers about it. What effect does cocaine have on your body? Where does cocaine even come from? How does a cocaine high feel? And if you're addicted to cocaine, how can you get better? You've got the questions, we've got the answers, and we recommend you listen closely. You don't want to become another tragic statistic. Let's start off by answering the most important question: what is cocaine? At its most basic level, it's a type of naturally occurring chemical known as a tropane alkaloid. Derived from the leaves of the South American coca plant, once it's extracted from the plant, it's typically processed into a powdered form called cocaine hydrochloride. Cocaine is a nervous system stimulant, a class of substances that also includes MDMA, caffeine, nicotine, and prescription medications like Ritalin and Adderall. Like all stimulants, its main effect is that it gives the user an energy boost and stimulates the brain's reward pathway. This, as you might guess from the name, is one of the parts of the brain that produces dopamine, a chemical that the brain releases as a form of positive reinforcement. Normally, the reward pathway is activated by what the brain deems to be positive actions: exercise, eating your favorite foods, finishing a complex task, and listening to music, all things that cause your brain to produce dopamine. But cocaine sends the reward pathway into overdrive, resulting in intense excitement as well as an inflated sense of self-confidence. On the extreme end, a cocaine user might also experience psychotic delusions, and all that excess energy can cause heightened aggression. Other side effects of cocaine use include raised blood pressure, raised body temperature, and photosensitivity due to pupil dilation. The high doesn't go on for very long. On average, users start to come down after 15 minutes to a half hour. Even if the high is worn off, the drug isn't immediately flushed out of your system. Traces of cocaine can be picked up in blood and saliva samples for up to 2 days after use, and in urine samples for up to 4 days after. Cocaine use can even be detected by testing hair samples. Metabolized cocaine can be found in your hair for up to 3 months after taking it, which is just another reason to be suspicious of your boss if he asks for a hair sample. Before we get into some of the even more severe side effects of cocaine, some of which have had extremely devastating consequences for huge swaths of the American population, let's rewind the clock to see how this prolific drug made its way into modern hands in the first place. Cocaine has had a long history as a medical treatment, going all the way back to the indigenous people in the Andes Mountains in South America. Evidence recovered from mummies in the region suggests that cocaine has been used in the area since at least 1000 BC. The Wari and Inca people frequently used the coca leaf as a stimulant, painkiller, and as treatment for altitude sickness when climbing up and down the Andes Mountains. Coca leaves are still used in the same way to this day by the people who live in and around the Andes. Typically, the leaves are chewed or boiled in a kind of medicinal tea. It can also be used to treat mouth ulcers and toothaches by wrapping coca leaves around alkaline burnt ashes and placing the sachet inside your mouth. Coca leaves were also consumed to lessen the effects of cold and hunger, which are common problems for people living in remote, high-altitude locations. When the Spanish first invaded South America, they saw the locals using coca leaves and immediately knew they wanted some of those magic leaves for themselves. When Francisco Pizarro conquered the Inca people in 1532, the Spanish Empire began exploiting the coca plant, forcing the natives to farm it in mass quantities so it could be exported back to Europe. Cocaine really took off in the West in the 19th century after chemists figured out how to isolate cocaine from the plant itself. In this new powdered form, it became a very common ingredient in medicines to treat fatigue, depression, chronic pain, and even poor sexual performance. In a totally crazy move that really could have only happened during the 19th century, in 1863, a Corsican chemist named Angelo Mariani started selling a drug called Vin Mariani, a mix of cocaine and wine. And of course, cocaine was also an ingredient in Coca-Cola. Like a lot of soda fountain classics, Coke was originally sold as a patent medicine, a type of brand name over-the-counter drug that was very popular in the 19th century and had dubious health benefits. In the early 1900s, however, an FDA crackdown on quack medicine and a push for cleaner labeling on consumer products led to a lot of patent medicines disappearing from shelves. The ones that did survive did so by drastically changing their formulas and rebranding as soft drinks, including Coca-Cola, which was totally cocaine-free by 1929. Cocaine was phased out of a lot of medicines over the course of the 20th century, though its effectiveness as a numbing agent and a vasoconstrictant means it's still used as a topical anesthetic to this day. It's most common in nose, eye, and throat surgery, where the blood vessels are very delicate and need to be shrunk to avoid damage. In terms of recreational use, cocaine exploded in popularity in the 1970s and 80s when it became associated with the clubbing culture and gained a glamorous reputation for being the drug of choice for rich playboys and rock stars. Cocaine's pretty versatile as far as drugs go, and it can be taken in a number of ways. Most commonly, the powder is rubbed onto the gums or inhaled through the nose, but it can also be dissolved in water and taken via injection. Its freebase form, known colloquially as crack cocaine, we'll talk about crack again later, is also smoked. Cocaine usually isn't taken orally though. With a pKa of 8.6, cocaine is a weak base which interacts with the digestive acid in a way that makes it absorb poorly through the stomach. You can still get high from ingesting cocaine, but the effect is weaker and it takes longer to kick in. Conversely, absorption of cocaine through the gums or nostrils means the chemical crosses the blood-brain barrier faster than other methods. When taken this way, the cocaine high will hit within only a couple of minutes of taking the drug. The quick-fix nature of cocaine is one of the biggest drawbacks of taking it. It's addictive. Like we said earlier, the high only tends to last about 30 minutes and you begin developing a tolerance to the drug's effects from the very first dose. On top of this, as is the case with a lot of stimulants, the users experience an unpleasant mood and energy crash when its effects start wearing off. So in order to delay the come down, users might keep taking bumps to prolong the high, even though each bump will have less and less of a positive effect each time, meaning that more and more doses are required to reach the desired high. Given what cocaine does to your blood pressure, this can have extremely deadly consequences. Cocaine overdose can cause heart attacks or stroke, and habitual cocaine use can lead to all kinds of serious heart conditions, as well as the onset of stress-related disorders and psychosis. Coke bugs is a common delusion suffered by cocaine users going through psychotic episodes, where the sufferer believes that bugs are crawling under their skin. Most people who use cocaine only do so casually, in no small part because of how expensive the purer strains of cocaine can get. They might try it once or twice while at a party or a club, and may never do it again. But that doesn't mean they're totally off the hook, as even casual cocaine use has its negative effects. Snorting cocaine can cause damage to your nasal passages in the short term, a blocked or runny nose on the mild end, and nosebleeds on the more severe end. Remember when we said that cocaine will shrink the blood vessels when it's applied? Well, when you combine that with a rise in blood pressure, it means that more blood is trying to get through the veins that are becoming thinner and thinner, leading to blood vessels in the nose rupturing and leaving you with a bloody nose. The damage done by infrequent cocaine use can heal on its own, but habitual users can often suffer from a constantly runny nose, chronic nosebleeds, complete loss of their sense of smell, and a weakened immune system. In extreme cases, people who regularly snort cocaine can contract something called invasive fungal sinusitis, a nasty infection that causes parts of the nose to rot. Even if you don't catch invasive fungal sinusitis, cocaine abuse can still make part of your nose rot off. The powdered form of cocaine is cocaine hydrochloride. So when you absorb the cocaine, you're left with the hydrochloride. If too much hydrochloride builds up in your nose, it can form hydrochloric acid, which breaks down the cells in the nose over time. Ouch! Cocaine isn't very good for your teeth either. Much like taking it through your nose, taking it via your gums can leave you open to infections. Like all stimulants, it has a dehydrating effect and can lower the production of saliva, which leads to a loss of tooth enamel. Cocaine use can also cause involuntary tooth grinding, which can further damage your teeth and gums. Taking cocaine intravenously is probably the most dangerous way to take it, as on top of the risk of stroke, heart attack, and psychotic breakdowns, you also have to worry about fun things like embolism and needle contamination. Incidentally, Sherlock Holmes, the famous detective from the novels of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, was a periodic user of injected cocaine. Goes without saying that this was a little more normalized during the Victorian era than it is now. Strangely enough, people who consume cocaine this way also often report getting tinnitus straight after injecting, which usually lasts for a couple of minutes. Those who inject cocaine are more likely to overdose, as the high wears off a lot faster than it does when taken through the nose or gums. Cocaine is also sometimes mixed with heroin to create something called a speedball, which is extremely dangerous as the complementary effects of the two drugs together make it hard to recognize symptoms of overdose. A lot of people have died as a result of a speedball overdose, including a number of celebrities such as John Belushi, River Phoenix, and Philip Seymour Hoffman. Combining cocaine and alcohol is also a pretty bad idea, since the chemicals combine and form a substance called cocaethylene in your liver. Cocaethylene produces a more euphoric high, but it increases your risk of developing heart problems significantly. The fact that cocaine is a social drug also means it's often associated with blood-borne illnesses like hepatitis C. People tend to do cocaine in groups, and when they snort lines with the same straw or inject it with the same needle, it greatly increases the likelihood of illnesses spreading from person to person. Now that we've covered the effects of cocaine, let's circle back to its freebase form, crack. Cocaine in its powdered form can't be smoked, as it burns too completely and too quickly. But in its solid or freebase form, it has a melting point of 98 degrees Celsius, which means it can be sublimated and inhaled as a vapor. Crack cocaine is made by boiling cocaine powder and water over a constant heat and mixing in some base, such as baking soda. The mixture then cools into a brittle crack rock that can be broken into smaller pieces and smoked using a pipe. Like any drug taken by smoking, crack can cause long-term damage to lungs, to the point that crack users cough up blood. Crack comes with its own unique side effects compared to, say, cigarettes or marijuana, due to the unique way it has to be smoked. Unlike weed or cigarettes, the vapor produced from melting a crack rock loses its potency very quickly. Crack pipes are typically very short to reduce the time it takes for the substance to travel from the pipe to the user's lungs as much as possible. And since crack pipes are normally made of glass, they tend to get very hot very quickly. Because of this, people who smoke crack will develop blisters on their lips and fingers from touching the hot glass too much. Crack became such a hot-button issue in American culture that in its heyday, bizarre public service announcements featuring a wide range of public figures, such as movie star Clint Eastwood and children's entertainment character Pee Wee Herman, were televised across the U.S., hoping to discourage people from taking the drug. During the moral panic around crack cocaine in the 1980s and 90s, when the drug became popular in low-income neighborhoods across America, concerns were raised about the health of children born to parents who smoked crack. The term crack baby arose as part of that moral panic, and many anti-drug groups argued that crack usage in pregnant people would lead to a generation of children with poor health, low intelligence, and underdeveloped social skills. This turned out to be a greatly exaggerated fear based mainly on racism and classism. Studies done since have shown that compared to the effects of nicotine and alcohol use during pregnancy, the effects of cocaine on fetal development were negligible. However, cocaine abuse during pregnancy can cause a miscarriage and can in some cases trigger premature labor. Crack is also cheaper than powdered cocaine, which means it's more likely to be cut with other drugs and potentially poisonous substances. This is not to say that powdered cocaine is never cut with any hidden nasties though. Cheap cocaine is often cut with baking soda, quinine, or sugar, which can cause blockages in blood vessels when injected or respiratory infections when inhaled. It can also be cut with a drug called levamisole, which heightens the drug's effects but has been associated with the development of autoimmune disease. Cocaine's also increasingly being contaminated with fentanyl, an extremely potent synthetic opioid. While many have speculated that drug manufacturers combine the two drugs intentionally, tests done on seized cocaine by police suggest that fentanyl is usually only present in trace elements. Fentanyl has become a very popular drug in the past decade, and it's likely that cross-contamination occurs simply as a result of the two drugs being processed in the same lab or from them being stored in the same places. But because of how potent fentanyl is, consuming drugs with even trace elements of it can have noticeable negative consequences. Like a speedball, the mix of fentanyl and cocaine can have deadly effects if the signs of overdose aren't spotted quickly. Given that cocaine addiction can lead to all of these horrible effects, it might give you some comfort to know that the physical effects of cocaine withdrawal are fairly minor. Cocaine withdrawal can cause disturbed sleep schedules, increased appetite, slower reaction time, and fatigue. These physical symptoms usually start to go away a few days after quitting. However, the psychological effects can be much more severe. Cocaine withdrawal can often cause severe depression and anxiety, as the brain's reward pathway needs time to repair itself from overstimulation. Therapy can help to alleviate these psychological symptoms, but the process of recovery can take years. And during that time, the person may feel compelled to relapse and start taking cocaine again. That's why it's important for people trying to quit cocaine to have a social support network, and why group therapy is so important in cocaine addiction rehab. Because while many have survived and moved on from cocaine use, it only takes one unlucky session for things to take a turn for the worst. Before a medical drug makes its way into the market, it has to go through various stages of testing. This starts with a laboratory investigation, which might begin with lab-grown human cells and computer models. If the drug passes that test, then scientists move on to animal testing. If the drug gets the green light again, we bring in the humans. The drugs are tested on people in what we call clinical trials or drug studies. These trials might include healthy people or sick people. They can test a drug's effectiveness, side effects, or how the body absorbs it, bioavailability. The drug should already be safe, but there have been times that things went horribly wrong. That's what we'll talk about today in this episode of The Infographic Show, medical drug trials that turned into living nightmares. Before we get to the horror, let's first paint a picture of what medical trial might look like. They don't always create elephant men. Our last and most disturbing tale on this list. Let's say you're testing for bioavailability. Generally, you'll apply to do the test and then be asked to come in for an interview and some checks. If you pass, you're given a date and location where the study will take place. You'll likely be asked to fast just before you come in, not take drugs, including alcohol, and possibly even grapefruit juice. All trials are different, but one man told us when he did trials in Montreal, Canada, that he would turn up to a center and then was told he would be a number as well as a name. He fondly remembers being number 17 during one trial. He said the center had a pool table, rooms with bunk beds, TVs, and game consoles. There were also books and magazines to read. Everyone had to eat the same food and finish the meal. All participants ate according to their number, and that's why everyone wanted to be number 1. After a while, he said everyone is peeing and pooing almost in line with their numbers. You can leave the study, but you won't usually get paid. He said being confined with other snoring, not always nice men can be challenging, and on his trials at least one day involving having 20+ blood draws. If you don't have a catheter, this can turn your arms black and blue. Many of the people were jobless and desperate. Some were musicians or writers, and others were actually medical students from Montreal's universities, he said. He got about $200 a day, and the longest trial he did was 2 separate runs of 5 days. So it's not a bad paycheck for doing nothing but playing games and reading. No one in his trial had a bad reaction to the drug, although he said there were heated arguments at times over the TV channel or someone's loud snoring, and some people fainted during the blood draws. Okay, so you get the picture. We'll start with some lighter stories and finish with 2006's horror trial that shook the world. All these are fairly recent cases, but going back to the past, we could certainly dig up some shocking tales, such as the testing of the drug thalidomide. If it kills monkeys. This recent trial that went wrong took place in France in 2006. It was so bad that the European Union decided it was time to create new laws that protected volunteers. The trial was said to have been bungled, and it led to the death of 1 man and brain damage of 4 more. A company called BioTrial was testing a compound called BIA 102474 that was being tested to cure a number of diseases. The volunteers at the trial at first did not suffer any serious side effects, but when their dose was increased, volunteer 2508 said his vision went blurry and he had headaches. We expected to see him come back, said one of the staff, so the trial continued. The man, a 49-year-old artist, was declared brain dead the next day. As for 3 of the 4 others that were sick, a doctor later said that even in the best situation, there will be an irreversible handicap. The payment was around $2,200 for 2 weeks. An investigation later revealed that several monkeys had died during pre-human testing, but this information was not in the study protocol report. Drug blindness. This story involves women taking part in a drug trial to improve eyesight. What happened was exactly the opposite. They lost their sight.
The Independent in the UK called the 2017 drug trial botched. It certainly was. The US patients even had to pay $5,000 to take part. They were testing stem cell treatments to improve their eyesight as the aged women suffered from something called macular degeneration that can make some objects look blurry. They're now totally blind and unlikely to recover, an associate professor of clinical ophthalmology at the University of Miami told The Independent. Reports suggest the study was a kind of Wild West trial, with some experts saying it wasn't even founded on scientific evidence. The Independent writes the treatment involves combining fat tissue removed from the patient's abdomens with enzymes to obtain adipose-derived stem cells. That was mixed with blood and injected into the women's eyes. But the drug was injected into both eyes at once, which is a very fundamental mistake. They might have only lost one eye's sight had the test been done right. In all, the study was kind of a Dr. Frankenstein experiment according to experts, and the women now see nothing at all. Enlarged brains. This terrible tale happened in 2016 when 5 people died after testing a medicine called chimeric antigen receptor (CART) in the USA. The treatment was seen as possibly a miracle cure, which consisted of adding extra disease-fighting protein to a person's immune cells. All the people in the trial had leukemia and were hoping to be cured. The treatment was seen as a great breakthrough in medicine and even won prizes, but things went wrong during one trial. The company doing the trial admitted that an internal investigation revealed the patients had died due to severe cerebral edema. The worst thing is the trial continued as they thought they knew what had caused this brain swelling, and then in a subsequent trial more people died. CART therapy is still seen as a possible cure for cancer, although in 2017 during a French trial we were told one patient died from multiple organ failure, probably triggered by neutropenic sepsis at day 15. We should add here that hundreds of people die each year in drug trials in the US and UK, thousands in India, but many of those people are already on death's door. That's certainly not always the case though, as you'll see. Pocket money. 19-year-old student Nicole Wan was a healthy young girl who took part in a medical trial in 1996 to earn a bit of extra cash to pay the bills and have some fun. She would have got $150 for taking part in a trial at the University of Rochester Medical Center in New York State. The New York Times wrote that the researchers had violated their own guidelines by giving the girl an increased amount of anesthetic lidocaine. The test was to see what effect pollution had on her respiratory system, and that involved having a tube inserted into her lungs. For that, you must have a local anesthetic, as without it, it would be mightily uncomfortable. The Times wrote at the time, she never told her parents, a restaurant worker and a seamstress who are immigrants from Hong Kong and live in Queens. Because she was given so much anesthetic, after the study the young woman started to feel weak and had a lot of pain. 2 days later, her heart stopped and she died. She was coughing and having difficulty, the doctor told the Times. So they kept spritzing more lidocaine down her throat, he said. Reports also state the girl had not known exactly the kind of test she would be going through. The Elephant Man trial. Finally, we come to perhaps the scariest story in drug study history. What we know about anyway. It happened in the UK in 2006 at London's Northwick Park Hospital. 8 very healthy young men would be given an experimental immune system drug called TGN 1412 for the treatment of leukemia. After taking the drugs, things turned very dark for 6 of them. 2 lucky others took the placebos. The story sounds like something from a horror movie. It was all manic. Everything was happening all at once. They were vomiting, they were screaming in pain, people fainting, said one BBC documentary on the disaster. As the men's organs failed and their temperatures rocketed, their bodies also swelled in the extreme. Some reports say their heads almost doubled in size, hence Elephant Man trial. No one knew what happened. This was a mystery. We had no way of predicting how severe it was going to get. There was no rule book for how to deal with this, one doctor later said. One man told The Guardian, "I started shouting, 'Doctor, this pain is killing me, do something.'" He recalled the placebo takers were happily reading books, although some reports say they were later horrified by what they saw. The Guardian writes that one man suffered heart, liver, and kidney failure, pneumonia, septicemia, and frostbite-like symptoms that resulted in his toes and sections of his feet being amputated and several fingertips falling off. They were all rushed to intensive care and the trial was declared by police a crime scene. Amazingly, they all survived, but what happened to them may mean they don't live long lives. They're all still alive today though. We imagine they got their $2,500 for the trial and at least one of them claimed millions in compensation. Although one medical website writes, the long-term effects on their immune systems remain unknown, though on discharge some were warned they may suffer an increased risk of cancers and autoimmune diseases. A bit of advice if you're going to do a drug trial. Be sure to do your research. Is the drug new? Are you the first to test it? That's a matter of importance. You definitely don't want to end up needing to rely on dangerous drug trials to make ends meet. Robberies. They're messy business. We've all heard some gruesome tabloid stories of tweakers with cheap handguns shooting up a liquor store for $20 and a fistful of change. Or maybe the knockout mugger, arrested after a string of robberies and assaults, going to jail for a half-decade for money a white-collar criminal triples in an hour. These things happen so often in the US that they barely even make the news anymore, and often end up ruining the lives of both the victim and the perpetrator. But let's see how a Colombian pro does it without even needing to carry a weapon. A pro like Demencia Black, the street name of a Bogota drug dealer interviewed by Vice in 2012. Demencia doesn't need to carry a gun or a knife because he's packing something even more deadly, a fistful of devil's breath, a chemical compound dubbed the world's scariest drug by many. And today you're going to find out why it's earned such a terrifying reputation. Let's say Demencia wants to rob a man for all he's worth. He'll spot his target, perhaps a businessman boozing at a local nightclub without a care in the world. The kind of guy with a Swiss watch and a platinum American Express card, both of which he loves to flaunt. When nobody's looking, Demencia will stroll toward his target with a smile, wearing a casual t-shirt and shorts. Hardly the most intimidating outfit for a hardened criminal, but you don't need to look scary when you have the devil's breath on your side. It's a fine, white powder similar to cocaine in appearance, but its effects are an order of magnitude more potent. Demencia taps his mark on the shoulder, and when the yuppie turns to him, Demencia raises his hand, a scoop of devil's breath nestled in his palm, and blows it into the victim's face. By this point, it's already over. In Demencia's own words from the aforementioned Vice documentary, with just that flash, the person is totally drugged. You wait a minute, and when you see it kick in, then you know that you own that person. You can guide them wherever you want. It's like they're a child. As for Demencia, this robbery truly is like taking candy from a baby. He tells the drugged businessman to get up and follow him, and the businessman does exactly as he's told without a single complaint. The two of them take an evening stroll to a local ATM, and the businessman happily empties his entire bank account for Demencia. After all, people high on the devil's breath aren't exactly famous for saying no. By the time the transaction is over, Demencia has made the kind of score your average American stick-up man can only dream of, and he did it without even carrying a weapon. A lot of stories about devil's breath, also known by its scientific names scopolamine and hyoscine, play out exactly like this. Whether they're true or scary urban legends, they often follow the template of a manipulative criminal using the drug to make someone do something they wouldn't normally consent to. Because the drug is synthesized from a number of plants, including a type of nightshade common in the upper region of South America, it's become a favorite among shady characters in the Colombian underworld. One famous and often repeated example is a man meeting a beautiful woman in a club one evening and deciding to take her home to his Bogota apartment. However, when he woke up the next morning, he found that the woman was gone and his apartment was totally empty. Furious, he went downstairs to ask the doorman what happened. The doorman told him that a van had pulled up in front of the building in the middle of the night, and he and the woman had loaded all his possessions into the van. He asked the doorman why he didn't say something, and the doorman said that he had. The man said it was just fine, and he knew what he was doing. He would later find that the devil's breath had been slipped into his drink back at the bar. He'd entered a state so suggestible that he was willing to be an accomplice in a wholesale burglary of his own apartment. And sadly, robbery is not the full extent of the drug's use in criminal context. There have been a disturbingly large number of reports of the devil's breath being used to facilitate forced consent in sexual assaults, in place of the perennial drug Rohypnol, commonly known as roofies. Some incredibly sensational reports have even claimed that scopolamine is being used to incapacitate victims for organ harvesting operations. Though to be honest, that last one is most likely about as true as the hook-handed man on Lover's Lane or the killer hiding in the back seat. The same goes for stories of criminals somehow soaking the drug into business cards and passing them to unwilling victims. As scary as the thought would be, or just the thought of having to talk to a stranger for long enough to get their business card, it's unlikely that there's any truth to it. There just isn't much of a pharmacological basis for dangerous quantities of the compound being soaked into the skin through those means. But of course, the truth has never gotten in the way of a good horror story. It's a global tradition to move between eras of drug hysteria every few years, with one fashionable drug at a time typically being labeled the world's scariest drug. Typically, these drugs are connected to a huge number of horror stories and given supposed effects that sound like something out of a scary movie. In the 1980s and 1990s, people across the US were terrified that PCP, or angel dust, was turning drug addicts into unstoppable, super-powered killing machines. A few decades later, after the high-profile cannibalistic attack of Rudy Eugene, the so-called Miami Zombie, on Ronald Poppo, people were calling bath salts the zombie drug, despite the fact that Eugene was never actually shown to have the drug in his system during the incident. A wide variety of other drugs have been given the same treatment, from flakka to crocodile, and the devil's breath is no exception. However, even if some of the tales of devil's breath terror are exaggerated, the product of tall tales told by drug dealers getting high off their own supply, scopolamine is still a genuinely dangerous drug when abused. In 2015, the U.S.'s Overseas Security Advisory Council gave an unofficial estimate that there are 50,000 scopolamine-related incidents in South America every year. Naturally, this has put the fear into potential vacationers considering a Colombian getaway, and likely caused a few sleepless nights for members of the Bogotá tourist board as a result. Scopolamine can have incredibly toxic effects on the body in high enough doses. Many scientists believe that scopolamine depresses the central nervous system and can lead to a bevy of side effects, from hallucinations to severe drowsiness to dry mouth, cardiac arrhythmia, and amnesia. If you overdose on the stuff and can't find treatment in time, it's extremely likely you won't live to see tomorrow. And when the elderly are given the drug, it massively increases the risk of dementia. So even if it doesn't turn you into a zombie on the spot, the drug can rob you of your mind and cognitive faculties in even more terrifying ways in the long run. You'd much rather deal with Dementia Black, the Colombian drug dealer, than the kind of degenerative dementia that turns your life into a living hell over time. However, there is another side to scopolamine that'll probably surprise you, namely the fact that it has a wide variety of medicinal uses even today. Despite mainly coming into fashion as the scary South American mind control drug in the last 2 decades, scopolamine actually has a long and storied history. Early unrefined forms of scopolamine in Hyoscine have been used by various cultures for thousands of years. For example, the Aboriginal people of Australia, the oldest continuous culture on Earth today, have long used similar chemicals from the soft corkwood tree in bush medicine. And because of the powerful psychoactive properties of hyoscine, it also has been used for spiritual purposes across the globe for thousands of years, including states of ritualistic religious hallucination in users. It entered popular Western medical use in the late 1800s, pioneered first by German scientist Albert Leidenberg, and later suggested as a medical anesthetic by surgeon Dr. Schneiderlin. Because of its wide array of effects, the drug was tried out for various purposes throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. It came into use as a popular anesthetic for childbirth, an antidote to gastrointestinal spasms, and an effective treatment for post-operative nausea and vomiting. That last one is actually still one of its most common uses today. Scopolamine and similar chemical compounds have been used to stave off nausea for over a century now. From tribal chiefs to the Allies in World War II storming the beaches of Normandy, these chemicals have proven to be the most effective in staving off seasickness. But it just isn't the sea that a small dose of scopolamine can make a world of difference in. Most scientists agree that scopolamine is the gold standard when it comes to preventing all kinds of motion sickness, and wearing a small prescription scopolamine patch can make your travels far smoother than they've ever been before. But hey, this video was called the world's scariest drug, not the drug that'll stop you getting seasick. Are there other frightening uses of scopolamine? The answer to that question is absolutely. It goes without saying that Colombian drug cartels are unsavory people, vicious, ruthless outlaws who will do anything to turn a profit. And if that involves peddling and using drugs like scopolamine, so be it. But imagine if the drug's scary, mind-bending properties were used by a violent gang in full cooperation with this country's government. This exact situation played out during the mid to late 20th century in the Czech Republic, thanks to an extremely frightening group called State Security, colloquially referred to as the Czech Secret Police. Much like the East German Stasi, this group was a ruthless, repressive arm of the Soviet puppet state. They would spy, intimidate, torture, and murder to keep their masters in power. And like a lot of thugs working for repressive government regimes, a big part of their job was forcing confessions out of the perceived enemies of the state. And like a cheesy Bond villain, you better believe these guys had ways of making you talk. Of course, while state security were more than happy to grab the rubber batons and bolt cutters for some good old-fashioned torture, they also liked to mix it up a little. In the early 1900s, hyoscine had often been used as a kind of truth serum, but it was soon discontinued due to some of the unpleasant side effects we've already discussed. but state security weren't all that into human rights for their prisoners, so they had no problems with using a little of the devil's breath on their political prisoners to make them more open to suggestion. It's extremely likely that the answers produced by this method of questioning were unreliable to incoherent. But again, it's not like they really cared either way. As long as they got somebody, they were happy. And that's the story of the devil's breath, a semi-legendary drug favored by eccentric Colombian robbers, sufferers of motion sickness, and shadowy agents of the Czech secret police. Is it the scariest drug in the world? We'll leave that up for you to decide, given that much of its most terrifying stories exist somewhere in the murky space between fact and fiction. But either way, if Dementia Black is walking toward us with a handful of powder, we'll definitely be making a swift exit before he gets too close. A shot of liquid courage, a shared moment of bonding and escapism, even drugged-up zombie soldiers. Violence and mind-altering substances have always gone hand in hand. The truth is, countless wars throughout history have been fought while soldiers were drunk or high, and military conflict through the ages, including the modern day, have been shaped by the insane drugs soldiers are fed to win wars. Drinking and drugging rituals have long been a part of the culture of warfare. Indulging in alcohol or drugs together can help soldiers bond before going into battle, provide a much-needed way to cope with the trauma of war, and even enhance combat performance. Alcohol is the oldest, most tried-and-true drug of choice for warriors around the world, and armies have issued alcohol rations to their troops throughout history. The Russians favored vodka, while the British preferred rum. Germans have turned to beer, while ancient Romans and Greeks relied on wine for liquid courage. But armies from ancient times all the way up to today have often relied on even stronger drugs to win wars. According to the ancient legends, Nordic berserkers, the legendary Viking warriors who fought ferociously and without fear, were said to get their animalistic fighting powers from the animal skins they wore in battle. Recently, though, modern researchers have come to believe that their ferocity came from another source altogether, the black henbane plant. The plant's leaves could be dried and smoked or used to make wine and beer. The plant was a powerful hallucinogen, causing users to see and perceive things that aren't there. Berserkers believed that they were calling upon their gods and harnessing the powers of the spirit world to help them thrive on the battlefield. And it's likely that the trance-like state caused by ingesting the black henbane contributed to this feeling. While herbal drugs may usually be associated with a calm, peaceful high, they've also been known to cause intense anxiety, paranoia, and even panic. Given that these warriors were psyching themselves up for battle when they took the black henbane, it's highly likely that the effects were less mellow and more aggressive. They probably felt agitated and ready to fight, and felt dissociated from reality, making it easier for them to fight like wild animals and kill with abandon. Viking berserkers weren't the only ancient figures to tap into the powers of natural herbs. Eurasian warriors, especially Siberian tribes like the Chukchi and Koryaks, used psilocybin, more commonly known as magic mushrooms, to allow them to fight fearlessly and give them an edge in battle. And they even went so far as to drink the urine of the warriors who had previously ingested the mushrooms to take advantage of the residual psychoactive effects. The use of magic mushrooms and other natural psychoactive herbs continued into the 19th and 20th centuries. In 1879, when the British tried to subdue the Zulu tribe of Africa, they faced an enemy that seemed immune to fear even in the face of Britain's far more advanced weapons. Though the Zulu only carried spears and shields, they seemed unnervingly unafraid of the British's rifles and bullets. They likely had a little medicinal help in this department. The Zulu warriors had a multitude of mind-altering substances at their disposal, from medicated beer to daga, a South African variety of cannabis, to a powerful painkiller made from the Bushman poison bulb plant, which also had hallucinogenic properties. Thanks to the psychoactive properties of these drugs, the Zulu warriors would have felt disconnected from the reality of battle, allowing them to fight ferociously and without fear. Though the Zulus would unfortunately go on to lose the war, they did impress the British with their willingness to face death without fear, thanks to the help of pharmacology. As the nature of warfare changed and weapons and technology advanced, so too did the drugs that were used to fuel soldiers and win wars. World War I saw the first documented and widespread use of cocaine in battle. Both the British and Germans issued cocaine rations to their Air Force fighter pilots to give them a boost before they engaged in incredibly dangerous dogfights. World War I fighter pilots were tasked with a nearly impossible mission. They had to engage other aircraft in close combat in midair. They needed to dodge enemy planes while simultaneously trying to get the enemy in their crosshairs so their gunner could take them out, all while making sure not to crash their planes. It was a chaotic and terrifying environment, and cocaine helped the pilots keep their energy up and help them focus on the job at hand, without getting carried away by the very real fear that death could come at any moment. The Canadian infantrymen who also relied on cocaine called it forced march. since that was exactly what it was used for. Infantry troops that needed to be mobilized and moved long distances during the war often had to do so on their own 2 feet, enduring grueling marches through desolate, war-torn landscapes, knowing all the while the enemy could be anywhere waiting to attack. These marches could last for hours or even days, and once again, cocaine was their secret to success. The forced march pills, which were a combination of cocaine and caffeine, gave soldiers the energy and endurance to withstand hours of marching through difficult terrain to get to where they were needed, but also helped to blunt the fear that the enemy could be waiting for them around the next corner. The most famous stories of soldiers on drugs might have come from World War II, which is fitting considering that the entire 6-year conflict was largely fueled by speed. A favorite of the frontline soldiers on both sides, the Nazis' drug of choice was called Pervitin. It was an early version of crystal meth, and the German company Temler-Werke supplied the German military with 29 million of these so-called attack pills. Not to be outdone by their enemies, the Allies followed suit and issued millions of Benzedrine tablets to their soldiers. The British are estimated to have consumed around 72 million tablets, while the Pentagon's official estimates is that U.S. soldiers consumed between 250 and 500 million pills during the war. Bennies, as they were known, were even included in emergency kits for American bomber crews. Both the German attack pills and the Allied bennies provided their users with a boost of energy to help them cope with drawn-out battles and long-distance marches. It increased alertness and combated fatigue, which was helpful for keeping vigilant during long periods of watch duty and bolstered already exhausted soldiers who were about to go into battle. It also created a strong sense of confidence and bravado in the soldiers, allowing them to rush into enemy fire with little regard for their own life or safety. The role that speed played in World War II cannot be overstated. Experts now say that many of the Germans' early and decisive victories in the war were thanks in large part to the rampant use of Pervitin. The drug helped German soldiers march for hours past their breaking point, allowing them to capture huge amounts of territory relatively quickly. Historical accounts from early battles in Belgium described crazed German soldiers fearlessly charging directly towards machine gun nests, seemingly unaware of the hail of automatic gunfire raining down on them. This behavior understandably frightened the Belgian defenders, and it might have led to the widespread rumor that Germany had created unbeatable super soldiers. Even as these harder drugs entered the fray, they didn't fully replace the more natural substances of past centuries. The Soviets were rumored to have been on magic mushrooms during the Battle of Czerkesfehérvár in 1945, where they performed fearlessly and succeeded in capturing the city from the well-entrenched and much better equipped Nazis. Authorized drug use by American soldiers continued into the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, and the Vietnam War from 55 to 73, though it was now combined with rampant, non-sanctioned drug use. Speed continued to be the approved drug of choice, but now soldiers gained access to illicit drugs like heroin. Desperate soldiers would combine these two powerful drugs to create their own homemade injectable speedballs. This potent combination creates a push-pull effect, both boosting energy and helping them relax. The high from these speedballs was stronger and more lasting than the high they could get from using either drug on its own, and it helped the soldiers deal with the brutal conditions of war, as well as cope with the horrible atrocities they witnessed and even committed during these wars. Drug use during the Vietnam War reached epidemic levels, according to the Pentagon, by the time the U.S. withdrew from the war in 1973. Some 70% of all American soldiers in Vietnam had taken drugs. Shockingly, the authorized use of drugs by soldiers in combat continues around the world to this day. Modern-day terrorists have no qualms about using drugs to motivate their fighters and achieve their heinous missions. The terrorist group ISIS promotes the use of hashish and opioid painkillers within their ranks, and they're also well known for the pervasive use of the drug Captagon, a powerful stimulant that metabolizes in the body to form an amphetamine. This drug increases alertness, numbs fear, and induces a sense of courage and bravado, and so it's incredibly popular with jihadists undertaking suicide missions. The drug's also reported to increase strength, and there have been reports of fighters taking so much of the drug that even after being shot multiple times, they refuse to drop and continue to fight through their injuries. Even smaller terrorist organizations have capitalized on the power of drugs to create seemingly invincible soldiers. In his book, A Long Way Gone, Memoirs of a Boy Soldier, Ishmael Bey describes his horrendous experience as a child soldier in Sierra Leone and the rampant use of drugs to control and manipulate child soldiers in these loosely organized armies. According to Bey, the commanders would strategically keep their child soldiers high on what they called brown browns, a potent and highly addictive combination of cocaine and gunpowder. Gunpowder contains nitroglycerin, which helps the cocaine to spread more quickly through the bloodstream and delivers a faster, more intense high. Once these child soldiers were high on brown browns, they would essentially be immune to fear and would have little to no conscience. Their commanders would take advantage of this altered state and force the children to commit terrible atrocities while they were high. This knowledge and shame that they'd done such horrible things while high, combined with a heavy dependence on the addictive drugs, kept the child soldiers loyal, obedient, and easy to control. And it's not just the so-called bad guys still feeding the drugs to their soldiers the present day. As long as all procedures are followed to a T, the US military still issues amphetamines to pilots assigned to 8+ hour-long flight missions. These dexedrine pills, known as Go pills, promote wakefulness and keep their pilots alert on long endurance missions. To help soldiers calm down after battle and to combat the energy-boosting effects of the dexedrine pills, the US military also issues what they call no-go pills or sleeping pills to help soldiers recover and be ready for their next mission. Other countries are following suit. In the UK, France, and India, the drug modafinil has recently replaced amphetamines for use in endurance missions and to combat sleep deprivation among pilots and other members of the military. The history of warfare and the history of drug use are inextricably linked, and with modern militaries continuing to use substances to alter their soldiers and enhance their performance, this is a trend that shows no signs of slowing down. It'll certainly be fascinating to see what kind of insane drugs soldiers are fed to win wars in the years to come. Where there's a will, there's a way is a famous proverb, meaning that if someone is determined enough to do something, they'll find a way to accomplish it regardless of the obstacles. This is especially true as it pertains to drug cartels, who will do just about anything to ensure their products get delivered to their clients in the US. So what are some methods that are used to sneak drugs past Border Patrol? Well, let's put it to you this way. If you can think it, odds are it's been attempted before. The US-Mexican border has been increasing its security lately with the deployment of active duty troops, which reflect the budding militarization of the area. States that border with Mexico include California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. As of 2018, 2,000 National Guard personnel guard this line, with roughly half of them in Texas and the other half spread out throughout California, Arizona, and New Mexico. With so much protection, it can be difficult to envision cartels delivering drugs into the country successfully. So how on earth did they do it? Before we delve into all the creative methods that have been used to smuggle drugs, we thought we'd first examine some research to look at why drugs are a problem and the extent of its severity to better understand what we're dealing with. A 2015 report from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration explained that drug overdoses are responsible for more deaths in the U.S. than car accidents or gunshots. Some deaths were due to prescription drugs, others by cocaine, and many from the use of heroin. In terms of opioid overdose, Ohio ranks supreme with the highest death toll in the U.S. About 5,000 people are said to die from opioid overdoses in Ohio each year. This state also has some of the largest female prison populations in the country, with 35% of charges against women being drug-related. Drugs are an extremely powerful substance that can control the mind like an unstoppable force. Experiments on rats in the 1970s provided us with a lot of information on the issue. Scientists found that when given the opportunity, rats would choose to consume heroin or cocaine relentlessly to the point of destroying their bodies and brains until death overcame them through overdose. It can be difficult to resist because drugs trigger the pleasure center part of the brain, which reinforce an organism to consume more of the substance. This explains why campaigns that preach the slogan "Just Say No" often prove to be ineffective at stopping drug use. Drugs can magically alter our moods and shift us from feeling depressed and lonely to being happy and optimistic. Thus, it can be difficult to just say no to a solution for your awful feeling. Not all drugs are bad, and under the right circumstances, when monitored by a medical professional, they can be extraordinarily helpful for relieving the suffering of people who are experiencing very painful medical conditions. We spoke with some clinicians who explained that if there's a high rate of abuse or suspicion of drug abuse, this can often make doctors uneasy about prescribing certain prescription medications in fear of aiding the development of addiction. This can be extraordinarily difficult for people who truly need it for moderate to severe discomfort. Drugs in the wrong hands may also lead to seizures and higher rates of crime. According to a ForeverRecovery.com, a national survey shows that more than 32% of state prisoners and 26% of federal prisoners were using drugs when they committed their crimes. Does this imply that drugs directly cause people to commit crimes? Of course not. but it may suggest there exists a correlational relationship between the two. It's not surprising that mind-altering substances can pose as an influential factor on the thought processes that lead to certain behavioral outcomes, such as with acts of criminality. For instance, if a drug makes you feel invulnerable, you may then believe that you can get away with anything. If you take a hallucinogen, on the other hand, you may experience hallucinations or delusions that cause you to lose your sense of reality, such as having voices in your head telling you what to do. So now you might be wondering what types of drugs are smuggled into the US. For this, we examined the statistics of most commonly trafficked drugs into the US, as well as the percentages of offenses per drug. Going in ascending order, statistics show that oxycodone consists of 4.6%, heroin has higher rates up to 9.8%, crack cocaine is set at 13.1%, and marijuana resides at 21.5%. Cocaine and methamphetamine consist of the most commonly smuggled drugs at roughly 24%. Although Mexico isn't the only culprit, it is said to be the source of most forbidden drugs that enter the US. Now we can turn to the question you've been patiently waiting for. How do they do it? When you see how heavily guarded the border crossing is, it might appear impossible, yet there are a multitude of creative and ingenious ways that drugs have attempted to get across. Our first examples relate to the use of smuggling drugs by air from the ground. This includes the use of catapults. Now, we can guess what you're probably thinking right now. A catapult? Really? In multiple instances, cartels were caught using giant catapults to hurl drugs over the border into the US, where someone would retrieve them on the other side of the fence. Catapults have been found on numerous occasions on the Arizona-Mexican border, flinging sacks filled with drugs roughly 328 feet. To put this into better perspective, that's further than the height of London's Big Ben clock tower if this iconic landmark were to be propped horizontally across a large stretch of land. Talk about jumping the fence. In some instances, t-shirt cannons were also used to shoot drugs over the border. This may be unsurprising when considering that this staple of sporting events has often been used to fire contraband into prison yards as well. Mexican authorities also found and seized a homemade bazooka that was being used to launch marijuana into the United States. NPR explained that this bazooka had been adapted specifically to use a compressor for shooting out drugs. Mexican officials seized some 1,800 pounds worth of marijuana that may have reached the US by use of this bazooka. Finally, it may come to no surprise that drug smugglers would utilize the advent of drones. The Washington Examiner reported data showing that 15 drones had been spotted between Tijuana, Mexico, and Southern California from late 2017 to 2018. These drones carried drugs attached to them while flying over the border. Drones are also often used to spy on Border Patrol agents with a camera from hundreds of feet above. Since federal law enforcement agents do not yet have any tools for detecting drones, they must mostly rely on their eyes and ears. Even if they do spot one, however, they cannot shoot it down with their guns without approval, which leaves them pretty helpless to do anything about it for the most part. Also, because a person flying a drone can operate it from a few hundred feet to a couple of miles away, he may be very tough to locate. For this reason, owners of drones have often been able to avoid capture by US federal law enforcement. So, the next time your curiosity consumes you and you decide to use your drone to harmlessly spy on your neighbor's newly installed backyard swimming pool, you might consider that you're using a device that a drug smuggler would love to have his hands on. Your neighbor, however, probably won't be too thrilled about it, and you might overhear some yelling that sounds sort of like, "Darn you crazy kids!" We hope for their sake and yours that they're not in the middle of skinny dipping when you do this. That could be a disturbing and embarrassing scene. So we've discussed methods of drug smuggling by air, but what about underground? In 1990, a tunnel was discovered which ran 273 feet under the ground from a luxurious home in Agua Prieta, Mexico, to a warehouse in Arizona. Oddly, this tunnel was equipped with electrical lighting, a drainage system, and a trolley for transporting the drugs. An entire fancy operation was being conducted beneath the surface, and no one had any idea. What made it even more high-tech, according to InsightCrime.org, was that it possessed a hidden switch inside the luxury home that, when activated, boosted a pool table and concrete slab below it high into the air to open the way to a narrow shaft below. We must admit, that sounds pretty cool. One of the biggest tunnels was discovered in April 2016. It ran half a mile from a house in Tijuana, Mexico, to an industrial property in San Diego. It also was equipped with lighting, rails, and a ventilation system. The tunnel was designed to transport huge amounts of drugs. We're talking tons. This just goes to show how far people are willing to use their ingenuity when it comes to earning profit from dealing drugs. We suppose this is what you get when you combine drugs with too much spare time. Now let's delve into some of the most insane ways that drugs have been attempted to smuggle into the US. From cargo boxes to the inside of cars, there are many imaginative and innovative methods people have utilized in the attempt to sneak drugs into the US. Often, religious items, relics, or associations have been used by smugglers to appear innocent, wholesome, and to try to evade suspicion. This was the case in 2013 when 3 women from Colombia attempted to smuggle 4.4 pounds of cocaine that was strapped to their legs while they were dressed as nuns. Crossing the Mexican-United States border into Texas in 2008, an elderly woman was found driving with a 7-pound memento, a statue of Jesus. She probably thought that being old in combination with possessing a religious item would make her appear like the epitome of virtue. But she underestimated the powerful smelling ability of canine noses. Drug-sniffing dogs went crazy over the statue's scent, but initially officials didn't find any drugs inside of it. They later found that this was because the statue itself was the drug. It was molded out of plaster that had been mixed with the cocaine. We're not entirely sure how the receivers of the statue planned on taking the cocaine from it, but we suppose they would have thought of some way to do it. Still, if you find yourself putting forth a lot of effort to erode a Jesus statue for a hit, it's possible that it may be time to reassess what you're doing with your life. This occasion wasn't the first time an elderly woman was used to cross the border with drugs. On August 8, 2018, an 81-year-old woman was also driving in her car when she was stopped by CBP agents. The dogs also smelled something suspicious radiating from her vehicle, a 2011 Chrysler 200. Upon investigation, agents discovered $870,000 worth of heroin stashed inside. Now, we don't mean inside the car in plain view, like on top of the seat. We mean literally inside the car, stuffed in its rocker panels. In case you don't know a lot about the internal structure of a car, the rocker panel is located along the sides of the vehicle between the front and rear wheel, basically below the doors. You lift your feet over this each time you climb in and out of your car. A lot of people probably don't normally consider using this part of their car to hide things, so that's pretty creative. In October of the same year, 9 people were arrested when conspiring to sneak meth into Hawaii. The drugs were disguised as decorative artifacts, such as Aztec calendars and statues. Simple souvenirs? We think not. One of the wildest attempts to sneak across the border occurred on October 30, 2012, when a makeshift ramp was created to scale the 14-foot-tall border fence. A Jeep, presumably containing marijuana, attempted to drive over this ramp into the United States from Mexico. The perpetrator's plot was foiled, however, when the Jeep got stuck at the top of the fence. It started teetering, which made the 2 intruders panic and flee back to Mexico. It's comical to imagine the reactions on the faces of the officials when they first arrived at the scene. They probably mumbled something to each other like, "Well, now I've seen everything." Although our next examples did not occur at the US border, we think these make for honorable mentions. We must use full disclosure though and warn you that these methods may be disturbing, and we wouldn't recommend that you continue watching if you have a weak stomach or tend to get queasy easily. As we've discussed, people will use just about anything to smuggle drugs, including their own bodies. The best known method for this is to ingest tightly wrapped balloons full of drugs and transport them in the stomach. This is not only disgusting, but dangerous. In 2015, a 24-year-old Brazilian man was on a flight to Dublin from Lisbon. Out of nowhere, he became fiercely agitated before collapsing to the floor. He was later found dead after 1 out of 80 pellets holding nearly 2 pounds worth of cocaine burst in his stomach. In December 2012, a Colombian woman flying to Berlin tried to smuggle drugs inside breast implants. She probably figured that she'd get away with it because airport officials wouldn't dare ask to search her there in fear of being accused of sexual harassment. She could have gotten away with it if she didn't start complaining of severe pain. The agony became too unbearable to endure any longer, which pushed her to admit that she was carrying 2.2 pounds of cocaine in her breasts and seek help. More recently, in 2018, a Brazilian man wanted to transport 2.2 pounds of cocaine into Portugal. He did this by using padded swim trunks. The drugs were stored inside a pair of fake butt cheeks made of 2 cushion-like implants that were attached to his shorts. We suppose that, like the breast implant woman, he thought he could get away with pretending to have a huge rear end. If officials grew suspicious and asked to search him, he could simply act insulted and say something like, "No, I'm not carrying anything. That's just my butt. Hands off, please." But the man did not fool anyone, and police quickly caught on to his scheme. Adler Berryman Seal's grave marker is adorned with an airplane and a cross, the first quite fitting for the pilot, and the latter a questionable addition to some. It's the inscription of a rebel adventurer the likes of whom in previous days made America great, would likely enrage others. Why are there such strong emotions surrounding this man, born in July of 1939 and killed in February of 1986, who only lived to be 46? Well, his life from birth to death was nothing if not unique. Though christened Adler Berryman Seal when brought into the world on July 19th of 1939, all who knew him called him Barry. Growing up, he was described as fun, wild, and at times mischievous, like many other young boys. But he wasn't raised by just any family. Some sources claim that not only was his father Benjamin Curtis Seal a candy salesman, but he was also a supporting member of a white supremacist group, the Ku Klux Klan. While Klan membership peaked to an astonishing 4 million in the 1920s, the movement had lost steam with the Great Depression of the 30s and fell apart completely a few years after Barry's birth. It was not rekindled until later on in the Civil Rights era. However, the senior SEAL's bigotry seemingly endured despite the lack of public support and remained unwavering. One can only guess the things Barry was subjected to as a consequence while a young man growing up. Fortunately, Barry made a name for himself early on, not as a racist but as a remarkably gifted pilot. He first manned an aircraft in solo flight at the tender age of 15, after just 8 hours of practice. By 16, he was a fully licensed pilot. While others his age might work on a paper route or bag groceries at a store, Barry spent his time towing advertisements across the sky to earn some extra cash, and he knew just what to spend it on. He allegedly landed a plane on his high school football field in order to impress a girl and take her out on a date. As he grew older, Barry put his many talents to use in much more practical ways. He joined the Louisiana Army National Guard in 1961 and served as a member of the 20th Special Forces Group for several years. After doing his part for the country, he worked as an engineer for Trans World Airlines. However, his in-flight talents quickly became evident and soon elevated him to the position of command pilot. Once again, he was one of the youngest people to make it this far and operate his own Boeing 707. However, the promising start in life was soon to take a turn for the worse. Barry became injured on the job in 1972 and began to engage in some dubious activities during his time on medical leave. He started to fly explosives to Cuba for a friend affiliated with the mob. Though Barry was led to believe they were for use in the battle against Fidel Castro, this was not the case. He and others were arrested, but when witnesses for the prosecution could not testify, the case was ruled a mistrial. While not enough to derail his life as a jail sentence would, the scandal resulted in him losing his job as a Trans World Airlines pilot. Facing unemployment, he sought a paycheck elsewhere in much darker places. Based on information provided by his wife, it was in 1975 that he turned the corner from making a good, honest living to profiting exclusively off crime. It was just 4 years after Nixon declared drug abuse America's public enemy #1 that Barry began smuggling the stuff across the country's borders. He began with stashes of weed, then bridged over to pills, and finally to cocaine. This helped him develop some rather unsavory connections and brought him into close contact with the Medellin cartel. Eventually, he was transporting mass shipments of drugs on behalf of Pablo Escobar, its leader. Escobar and his crew had quite a reputation already at this point, but they were busy making it worse. They were behind the Medellin massacre that took place that same year and left 40 dead as retaliation for the seizure of their drugs by Colombian authorities. They also had a habit of referring to Barry as El Gordo, which means the fat man. However, Barry began a partnership with the nefarious criminals, nonetheless becoming an even greater one himself in the process. After hooking up with the cartel, he began to unload his cargo in sparsely populated areas of West Arkansas instead of Louisiana, the place he was most familiar with and called home. This was a much safer destination, especially considering how Barry would fling duffel bags of drugs from his plane to be snatched up by his accomplices waiting below. For years, he made mega bucks off this arrangement and accumulated a stash in the millions, until one day when a shipment was intercepted en route to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Just like that, his days of profiteering off the drug trade were over. Unfortunately, by that point, uncalculable damage had already been done. Upon being apprehended, Barry admitted that he had flown drugs into America more than 100 times, carrying between 600 and 1,200 pounds of cocaine a trip. This amounted to billions of dollars worth of illicit substances, and most assuredly resulted in the death of countless American citizens, not to mention the destruction of their families and a tragic ripple effect throughout society upon being sold off at their final destination. As a consequence of his actions, Barry was indicted in 1983, yet somehow only handed a meager 10-year sentence. However, to him, a man who liked to live life on the edge and engage in thrill after thrill, even this was too much. He tried on several occasions to offer his services to the FBI and operate as an informant in order to escape doing time. The FBI wasn't interested in making a deal, however. Not one to give up easily, Barry flew to the DC office of the Vice President of the Drug Task Force. He was redirected to the Drug Enforcement Administration, which at the time had only been around for about a decade. It was there that his proposal was accepted. Barry became part of an operation backed by the Reagan administration. However, they had ulterior motives of their own beyond simply bringing drug smugglers to justice. Reagan and his associates wanted to have the Contras militia in power in Nicaragua, not the Sandinista government. However, the US was in a bit of a pickle, as Contras were renowned for various human rights violations. In other words, they could not be backed without a reason, and it had to be a good one. Barry claimed to be able to give them this. Apparently, the Sandinistas were working together with the Medellin cartel in the drug smuggling business, and he could provide proof. Barry held up his side of the bargain. Landing in Nicaragua, the CIA's cameras on his plane captured images of the Medellin cartel and its leader loading cocaine with Sandinista soldiers' assistance. Perhaps wanting to give yet further importance to the mission, Barry later claimed that an associate of a Nicaraguan official was present as well. While this was questioned by some reporters, others believed this as well as everything else. Barry would come to wish they hadn't. The Washington Times soon published a story in which they described his trip and called him out by name. It was pretty clear from the piece that he had been working for the US government to disclose the underhanded dealings between the Sandinista officials and the cartel. The timing could not have been worse, as it also brought Barry's usefulness to an end. He had originally intended to stage a celebration with Escobar and other key players after successfully flying the cocaine to the States. However, this would work as a cover, as the men would be surprised and arrested. With his cover blown, this was no longer possible. The DEA assigned him to no more missions, and while Barry was somewhat safer by remaining in the States, he also no longer had the DEA's protection. The Medellin cartel was not without the funds to go after him in America, yet it would turn out that his own government, at least initially, got to him first. The FBI came after Barry once the DEA cut him loose, and he had returned to his home in Louisiana. While he was ultimately given only 6 months of supervised probation, it was in essence a sentence of death. He was mandated to be at a Salvation Army halfway house each and every day for 12-hour shifts to comply with the circumstances of his parole. In other words, anyone and everyone knew where he would be between the hours of 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. on a daily basis. Unsurprisingly, it was just outside of the Salvation Army building that Barry was murdered, while his friend watched in horror from the nearby Belmont Hotel. It was February 19th of 1986, and according to this friend, 2 killers approached Barry's car from both sides. While each carried machine guns, only one shot his weapon. Barry anticipated what was soon to take place and put his head down before the shots were fired. While definitely not without his faults, many claimed that the way Barry's life ended was reprehensible. They believed it was a disgrace that a man who put his own safety on the line while working for the country was essentially left out in the open at a time when he was most vulnerable due to its betrayal. Though he had allegedly refused witness protection, many claimed that in his own best interests he should have been forced to accept some sort of a defense. Fortunately, those who killed him answered for their crime. Assassins linked to the Medellin cartel were later found trying to flee Louisiana, and they were convicted of murder and sentenced to live out the rest of their lives behind bars. However, some believe that the way things panned out was just all too convenient. Some believe it was the CIA, not the cartel, who orchestrated the events surrounding Barry's death. It was rather nice that Reagan could use the photographs from Barry's secret mission once his cover was blown to gain public support for Contra's control. However, he may have just been taking advantage of an opportunity that had in essence fallen into his lap. Only a select few will know for sure. Whoever was ultimately behind Barry's death, many who knew him felt a sense of loss at his passing. He married 3 times and left 4 kids behind. Quite likable in person, he had many friends as well. To look at photos of Barry, who in his later years was quite portly with a double chin and a side-swept comb-over, you would never guess he was working on the opposing side in America's war on drugs. Because of those choices, those with loved ones who suffered from addiction may have been less than sorry to see him go. Despite opposing opinions, most agree that Barry got in over his head and paid the ultimate price, as most do when it comes to drug smuggling, let alone switching sides. While we've covered most of the known facts of Barry Seal's life and death, it's important to note that conspiracy theories surrounding his various exploits abound. Some have claimed that he carried out various government missions far before his last drug smuggling project for the DEA. This included an attempt to kill Cuban leader Fidel Castro, and while not the trigger puller, supposedly placed him at the scene of Martin Luther King's assassination. Some have even suggested he was the getaway plane operator after John F. Kennedy was shot. If any of these are true, those with the information to confirm it aren't talking, and it's likely they never will. Did you know that mice like to partake of the green stuff? Well, at least that's what a group of police officers tried to claim. In 2018, the upper management of a police department near Buenos Aires, Argentina, performed an inspection of impounded drugs. Curiously, out of the approximately 6.6 tons of confiscated cannabis that had been stored in a police warehouse for the past 2 years, only 6 tons could be accounted for. When questioned by a judge, a police commissioner claimed that the mice ate over half a ton of marijuana. Forensic experts from Buenos Aires University debunked the commissioner's explanation, saying that with their excellent sense of smell, mice wouldn't mistake the drug for food. Also, if they'd eaten large quantities of cannabis, a lot of mouse corpses would have been found in the warehouse. 8 policemen ended up fired, and the commissioner was investigated by the court to determine if the missing drugs were the result of expedience or negligence. That might be a funny incident, but how common is it for confiscated drugs to go missing? What actually happens to drugs seized by police? Generally, the procedure is determined by where the bust happened. Each country, and in many cases each jurisdiction or law enforcement agency within countries, have their own set of rules, regulations, and processes for confiscating drugs. In general, in the US, during a raid, arrest, or any situation where the police seizes narcotics, they immediately start a chain of custody for their items. Law enforcement must manage contraband while it's in their possession. They have to be able to show in court that the drugs have not been swapped, altered, or tampered with prior to testing. After the narcotics are seized, the confiscating officers take them to police station's property room. The officers then package the drugs in clear plastic bags along with case information, such as the seizing officer name, ID numbers, date, time, and case number. Any information is usually written in permanent ink. Then the plastic bags are heat sealed and tamper evidence tape is put over the seal. The officers initial and date the tape, so if someone was able to get the tape off without tearing it, it would be impossible for them to put it back on in a way that lines up with the other writing on the tape. Once sealed, the drug packages are submitted to the evidence management unit, who forwards them to a crime lab or a forensics unit, either in-house or off-site. The lab tests the drugs to positively identify exactly what the substance is. The drug ID provided by testing is crucial in helping law enforcement to file charges and make cases. Minus the small amount used for testing, the crime lab or forensics will return the drugs to the evidence management unit for storage pending case disposition. Now, if the case goes to trial, the prosecutor may request that the arresting officer bring the drugs to court. In this situation, evidence management would check the drugs out of the property storage room to the officer. They would then take them to court and return them to the property room after the hearing or portion of that trial they were needed for. Once the case completes, the time for an appeal passes and the evidence is no longer needed, the drugs are reclassified in the system as slated for destruction. Most jurisdictions hold drugs for the duration of the trial. On average, for a non-serious offense, the drugs might end up being held less than 3 years. For a large bust with a long trial with many defendants, seized narcotics could be held for 7 to 8 years. Sometimes police use the drugs slated for destruction for undercover operations and training, both canine and field test training for employees who may not come into contact with drugs often, but should be familiar with narcotics, such as probation, parole officers, and confidential informants. Most jurisdictions conduct biannual evidence destructions, or when the amount of contraband slated for destruction reaches a predetermined threshold, eradication is carried out. A common exception to storing all the seized narcotics of a case is live marijuana plant seizures, especially from commercial outdoor gardens. Law enforcement will collect representative samples for court. Then they'll use a backhoe or other gardening equipment to dig a deep hole and mass bury the other cannabis plants. Deprived of oxygen, the plants will quickly rot and die. For destruction, law enforcement agencies have many agreements with local funeral homes, factories, or hospitals to incinerate the contraband. Generally, incinerators burn hot enough to quickly and rapidly destroy the drugs while not producing smoke. Other jurisdictions use third-party contractors licensed to handle hazardous materials to destroy the drugs on their behalf. Then, there are some law enforcement agencies that burn the drugs themselves. Sometimes they get in over their own heads, such as in 2015 when a police force in Tangerang, a town 15 miles outside of Jakarta, Indonesia, decided to destroy 3 tons of cannabis in a bonfire. Realizing that the fire would give off fumes, local officials wore gas masks. However, they forgot about the town. Smoke from the fire spread and a significant portion of the town's residents got high or experienced dizziness and headaches. As our opening story highlighted, there are a few law enforcement officers out there with sticky fingers. Sadly, this is not an uncommon issue. While researching this video, we found multiple instances of cops in the US, UK, and other countries being caught stealing from a property storage. In some cases, cops even skipped the evidence storage part and simply misplaced the drugs during a raid or arrest. And that's what a pair of Canadian cops did. Misplaced marijuana-laced chocolate bars straight into their mouths. On January 27, 2018, Toronto constables Jamie Young and Vittorio Dominelli were part of a raid on a pot dispensary. Vittorio stole 3 hazelnut chocolate bars infused with cannabis oil. Later on that night, the 2 cops were on surveillance duty. After a discussion about having never tried marijuana, they decided to sample the chocolate. They ate 8 squares of 1 bar. 20 minutes later, the effects of the chocolate hit Vittorio like a ton of bricks. He started sweating heavily and thought he was going to pass out. He worried that he was going to die. About 2 hours later, Vittorio called for assistance over police radio using the 1033 police code, which indicates an officer is in serious trouble. He claimed he was about to pass out from running down the street. Responding officers said that the pair appeared to be in distress when they were found. They were both taken to a hospital. One of the responding officers slipped on ice during the call and also had to be transported to a hospital. Vittorio and Jamie faced misconduct charges under the Police Services Act. Vittorio resigned from the force. A judge called him a complete idiot for tampering with evidence. Due to Vittorio's theft, 7 of the suspects charged in the pot shop raid had their charges dropped. Sometimes the cops aren't stealing to satisfy curiosity or support a personal habit, they're running an illegal black market. In 2014, based on a tip, police in the UK conducted a raid on Police Inspector Keith Booth's home. They found cocaine, crack cocaine, heroin, ecstasy, and cannabis with an estimated street value of £700,000. They even found 24 pounds of cocaine hidden in his washing machine. Prior to his arrest, Booth was responsible for evidence storage at a West Yorkshire police station. Part of his job was to manage seized narcotics and make sure they were checked and signed off for disposal. However, instead he and his son Ashley ran a drug recycling ring and sold drugs to a network of drug dealers. Keith was pretty sly. On the surface, he was extremely diligent. He sent emails to colleagues expressing his concerns about missing or unlabeled drug packs and also made it his responsibility to have a CCTV camera installed in the storeroom. Ultimately, Keith was found guilty in a number of charges, including theft with intent to supply. Ashley was found guilty of 5 drug conspiracy charges. While we've discussed some of the more lighthearted examples of corrupt police stealing confiscated drugs, it's a serious issue. When law enforcement and the justice system can't be trusted, it erodes public trust. Unfortunately, it's difficult to find detailed statistics surrounding police theft. Sometimes it's classified as misconduct, especially when a case against the officer isn't pursued. When the theft is for personal use, especially if the officer is part of a smaller force, perhaps in a small town, the response and consequences vary greatly. Some cops are merely given a slap on the wrist, suspended, or forced to resign, perhaps fired and given suspended sentences with probation. Notably, in the US, an all-too-common scenario is that after a work incident involving physical trauma, an officer is prescribed pain pills and becomes addicted, or they develop PTSD due to the incident. In either case, over time, the officer spins out of control and starts stealing from the property room at work. Sadly, decorated officers of many years have brought lifelong careers to an abrupt end due to their addictions. For larger law enforcement groups, such as those servicing a city, and for scenarios where stealing confiscated drugs were just one aspect of overall poor behavior from an officer, the end result was often jail time, often after an investigation or a sting from the feds. Sometimes, staff other than police are derelict in their duty of the application of law in regards to impounded drugs. In June 2011, discrepancies were found in the paperwork of Annie Dukin, a chemist at the Hinton State Laboratory Institute in Boston. This lab IDs narcotics for several counties in the state of Massachusetts. Further investigation revealed that Annie had forged the initials of an evidence officer in her logbook. Despite being suspended from lab duties, Annie was still allowed to testify in court for 8 more months until February 2012, when Boston district attorneys were notified of the breach in procedure. Annie was finally placed on administrative leave and quit soon after. A police probe uncovered that for years Annie had altered and faked test results to hide her frequent dry labbing, or visually identifying samples without actually testing them. She only actually tested around 1/3 to 1/5 of the 60,000 drug samples that crossed her desk. Some co-workers had even brought concerns about Annie to their bosses, who turned a blind eye. It also came out that Annie didn't have a master's degree in chemistry from the University of Massachusetts Boston, as she had claimed on her resume and sworn in testimony. As a result of Annie's falsifications, the lab was shut down. Multiple charges, including 17 counts of obstruction of justice and 8 counts of tampering with evidence, were brought against her. Annie was sentenced to 3 to 5 years imprisonment and 2 years parole. Her only known motive for her actions was to look extremely productive and further her career. In the end, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court dropped 21,587 drug convictions that had hinged on potentially tainted samples processed by Annie. Several defendants filed civil suits. Annie's actions wreaked absolute havoc in many lives beyond court issues. Some defendants lost jobs, driver's license, or were deported. Others had marriages fall apart, lost access to kids, and paid a small fortune in lawyer and court fees. The state of Massachusetts continues to deal with the fallout from the scandal. One prominent attorney said that as many as 40,000 people could have been falsely convicted as a result of Annie's actions. 2 boats tear through the water in hot pursuit of a narco submarine. "Alta su barco! Alta su barco! Ahora!" screams one of the Coast Guardsmen just before 3 camouflage-clad members of the elite United States Coast Guard boarding team leap aboard the submersible, carefully balancing on the wet surface of the sub as waves rush over his feet. A Coast Guardsman pounds on the hatch. One of the drug smugglers opens it, putting his hands up in surrender. You may have seen the gripping footage taken by one of the Coast Guardsmen's helmet cams. On June 18, 2019, in the East Pacific waters off the Colombian and Ecuadorian coasts, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Monroe captured a 40-foot narco submarine. However, this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment bust or a stroke of good luck for the Coast Guard. This narcotics bust was set into motion about 12 hours earlier. The USCG Monroe, which is deployed out of Alameda, California, is a newer ship, having just been commissioned in 2017. It's just one of the Coast Guard's 8 Legend-class national security cutters. These ships featured advanced command and control capabilities, aviation support facilities, and increased endurance, making them perfectly suited for long-range patrols. The Monroe is 418 feet and can carry up to 148 crew depending on the mission and configuration. Early on in the morning of June 18th, the Monroe's commanding officer, Captain James Estramonte, received intelligence on a suspected narco submarine from a Navy P-3 surveillance aircraft, which was patrolling the Pacific Ocean roughly 200 miles west of the Colombian-Ecuador border. Submarines filled with drugs sound like the stuff of movies, but they've recently become a favorite way for cartels to transport illegal drugs secretly beneath the waves. Now, these aren't military-grade subs, with most only able to descend a few meters below the water at most, but that can often be more than enough to smuggle thousands of pounds of drugs like cocaine without detection. The suspected narco sub had been spotted heading north, some 250 miles away from the Monroe's current position. Based on that initial intelligence, the Coast Guard estimated that the smugglers had around 1,000 miles left to go before they would reach the United States. Captain Estramonte ordered the cutter's speed increased to 25 knots or 28 miles per hour in order to catch up with the illegal vessel. While en route, Captain Estramonte and the crew of the Monroe would devise their plan for how to take on the illegal narco sub, if that was in fact what they were approaching. Some 10 hours later, and about 20 miles from the sub, the crew of the Monroe was close enough to set their plan into motion. Armed with pistols and wearing night vision goggles, 13 members of the elite Coast Guard boarding team launched in 2 small boats, a 26-foot aluminum patrol boat called a Mark IV and a rigid-hull inflatable 35-foot long-range interceptor. Both of these vessels are built for speed, topping out at about 45 knots or 52 miles per hour. Meanwhile, as boarding crews were slicing through the water toward the sub, the Monroe's Helicopter Interdiction Tactical Squadron, aka HITRON, launched a helicopter to provide a sniper overwatch with a .50 caliber rifle, as well as provide visual play-by-play updates of the operation to the captain. The Coast Guard boats quickly pulled up on either side of the sub. A Coast Guardsman yelled for them to stop in Spanish, but the sub continued, the occupants likely unable to hear the command. Then, boarding team members jumped on the back of the sub and banged on the hatch, finally alerting the crew to their presence. Fortunately, the smugglers quickly surrendered without a fight, though the boarding team was prepared for an altercation. 5 suspected drug smugglers were arrested and handed over to the Drug Enforcement Administration. The Coast Guard spent the next 12 hours unloading the huge haul of cocaine from the sub. They seized more than 17,000 pounds of cocaine, worth an estimated $232 million, making it the Coast Guard's largest single seizure since 2015. Then, after a final sweep for contraband with photos taken for evidence, the sub was intentionally scuttled. This dramatic bust is only one episode in the long-running cat-and-mouse saga between the Coast Guard and drug traffickers. Throughout the 1980s, speedboats were the main drug-running weapon of choice for narcotics traffickers. The authorities fought back by deploying fast ships of their own. The cartels began to focus on smuggling cocaine concealed in products via cargo ship. In the late 1990s and into the 2000s, the United States, Mexico, and Colombia intensified their war on drugs, resulting in several massive drug busts at various spots. The cartels had to come up with new and creative ways to ensure their illicit products reached their destinations. For a long time, there were rumors of drug traffickers building DIY narco submarines in the jungles of South America and using them to transport drugs before the Coast Guard finally captured one in 1993. The vessel was wood and fiberglass, but could not fully submerge and only traveled at 10 miles per hour. Since then, narco submarines have grown increasingly more sophisticated. Some of the more recently captured vessels are equipped with GPS and are able to mask their heat signature, use lead siding to help mask their infrared signature, and are designed to be extremely difficult for radar, sonar, and infrared systems to detect. Many of the subs can travel at 18 to 22 knots or 20 to 25 miles per hour. Advanced narco subs can cost upwards of $1 million to build, but a single successful drug-running trip often allows traffickers to recoup their spending. The average narco sub is 40 to 50 feet long and can carry thousands of pounds of narcotics. U.S. authorities have captured vessels carrying as much as 7.5 tons of cocaine, with an estimated street value of $180 million. Narco subs also carry other illicit cargo such as weapons and cash. The Coast Guard actually classifies narco submarines into 4 types: low-profile vessels or LPVs, the top of which sit just above the waterline. These vessels aren't entirely submerged, but they're difficult to spot. Usually their tops are painted blue or in a way that makes visual spotting hard. The sub captured in the June 18th bust would be considered an LPV. Semi-submersible narco submarines are very similar to LPVs, the difference being that they can completely lower themselves below the waterline except for a snorkel-like tube or air duct to provide air to the crew. The third type of narco subs are fully submersible vessels. This style of drug smuggling submarines are rare due to the high cost and technical difficulties of building them. The final type of narco subs are torpedoes. These tend to not be technologically advanced and are designed to be dragged by a camouflaged ship. In the event of detection, the tow ship can drop the torpedo, which then activates a homing signal for later retrieval when the coast is clear. Since 2015, there's been an increase in the number of narco subs being built and used. Consumer demand for cocaine is high, business is booming, and coca production in Colombia is soaring. In 2018, cocoa cultivation in Colombia stood at 208,000 hectares. That's 803 square miles of coca farms. Narco subs are especially preferred by Colombian drug cartel members to export cocaine from Colombia to Mexico, which is often then smuggled via land over the border into the U.S. During the summer of 2017, the Coast Guard caught 7 LVPs, seizing around 22,707 pounds of cocaine worth more than $306 million. In August and September of 2018, the Colombian Navy captured 14 semi-submersibles in the Pacific Ocean, more than 3 times the number of vessels captured in 2017. According to a U.S. Foreign Military Studies Office report, 80% of the drugs smuggled into the U.S. in 2012 came from maritime routes. 30% of the drugs that arrived in the U.S. by sea were transported via narco submarines. About 85% of the cocaine smuggling between South America and the U.S. takes place in the eastern Pacific Ocean. Authorities prefer to stop the drug smuggling on the ocean before it reaches land because it reduces violence and maximizes the impact of cargo loss. When a narco sub successfully transports a load, upon arrival the drug packages are immediately broken into smaller loads for distribution, which are much harder to detect. As dispersal happens, the potential for violent incidents to occur rises. Currently, the U.S. Coast Guard is only managing to stop an estimated 11% of the vessels that pass through the East Pacific. The authorities have visibility on the majority of smuggling traffic, but don't have the capacity to address all the nefarious activity. Exacerbating the issue is the fact that the Pacific Ocean is huge, about the same size as the contiguous U.S., and the Coast Guard has a limited number of boats for patrolling. At any given time, 6 to 10 ships are on watch. Furthermore, 70% of the Coast Guard fleet is over 50 years old. Some of the aging boats are slower and require a lot of upkeep to be mission-ready. Even when the Coast Guard does manage to catch a narco sub, they have to move fast. The vessels have built-in valves that allow for purposeful dumping of drug evidence into the ocean and also sinking of the vessels to avoid seizure. The smugglers know that the Coast Guard will not allow them to drown. Originally, per maritime law, smugglers had to be rescued and released without criminal charges, usually back to their country of origin if there was no physical evidence of wrongdoing. In 2008, the U.S. Drug Trafficking Vessel Interdiction Act was enacted to close this legal loophole. It's now easier to prosecute smugglers in narco submarines whether they're caught with illicit product or not. Convicted smugglers are punished with prison terms of up to 20 years in the U.S. The June 18th seizure was one of 14 interdictions that took place during a month-long drug operation in international waters in the East Pacific. During the mission, over 39,000 pounds of cocaine and 933 pounds of marijuana, worth over $569 million, ended up being seized by the Monroe and 2 other Coast Guard cutters. In honor of the successful mission, several dignitaries attended a narcotics off-boarding event hosted on Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, California. Vice President Mike Pence gave a speech welcoming the Coasties home and praising a job well done.
Order in the court. Today we're putting Sweet Mary Jane on trial. Her other aliases include cannabis, weed, grass, hash, and ganja. She's said by some to be an unfairly maligned miracle cure to a whole bunch of different illnesses, while others accuse her of being an express trip to becoming a burnout with anxiety and lung problems. So, what's the truth? Is weed good for you, bad for you, or somewhere in between? We're going to hear arguments from both the defense and the prosecution, so pay close attention. Only you can decide if this plant is innocent or guilty. Let's hear the evidence. How exactly does weed operate? And we'll be talking about smoking it today, so let's not worry about oils or edibles. When you smoke weed, you inhale the smoke down into your lungs, where the chemicals pass through the alveoli, the 480 million tiny air pockets that you're liable to find in there, and straight into the bloodstream. The bloodstream is the express line straight to your brain, where the real magic happens. The body's got an endocannabinoid system. That's a fancy name for the network of neurotransmitters known as cannabinoid receptors attached to all of the neurons in your brain. These use chemicals like anandamide to communicate chemical signals in the body. The anandamide has an uncanny similarity to THC, the psychoactive chemical in our defendant today. In sliding on in and attaching itself to the brain's cannabinoid receptors, it hijacks several key systems in the brain and the nervous system to produce its distinctive effect, including the hippocampus, the orbitofrontal cortex, the hypothalamus, the basal ganglia, and the cerebellum. The most important to the average cannabis user is its effects on the brain's reward system, in the amygdala and the ventral striatum. It induces the body to release spurts of dopamine, the neurochemical that gives you pleasurable feelings after activities like exercise, good food, and even sex. And studies show that the dopamine released as a result of THC is even more intense than the regular batch. So we know why it makes you feel good, but so does beer and chocolate cake, and no sane person is ever going to argue that those are any good for you. So now we have the proper context. Let's hear the back and forth arguments. Is it a net good or a net bad to take up smoking the devil's lettuce? Before we get into the specifics of the body, let's talk about the effects cannabis use can have on your mental health. Starting with the defense. Many weed users will be quick to tell you that their habitual pot smoking helps regulate their mental health, taking the edge off anxiety and mitigating depression. CBD and low doses of THC have been shown to reduce anxiety in some smokers due to its effects on the brain's limbic system. In some cases, it's also been shown to reduce the frequency of panic attacks in people suffering from PTSD. However, the prosecution would have a strong case in saying that this is a double-edged sword. The effects of THC in particular can be vastly different from person to person and in some cases have some seriously detrimental effects on the user's mental health. For some people suffering from bipolar disorder, habitual weed smoking can make their symptoms worse. But don't worry if you don't already have bipolar disorder, there isn't any evidence that smoking weed will give it to you. However, that doesn't mean that chronic weed smoking might not open the door to other mental health struggles. In some users, because of chronic weed use's effects on their neural reward pathways, they might require more significant quantities of dopamine in order to stay at baseline level of emotion, resulting in depressive episodes. These reward pathway issues might also result in feelings of listlessness, low energy, and an inability to feel motivated. And while weed relieves anxiety for some, it has the opposite effect in others, causing edginess, irritability, and paranoia. Because of the psychoactive effects of THC, some brains predisposed to psychotic symptoms may see these exacerbated by habitual cannabis use. If a user is predisposed to developing schizophrenia, then smoking weed might push them in the wrong direction, increasing their risk of psychotic episodes. This is particularly true of people who started smoking weed too young. But what about sleep? Sleep assistance is touted as one of the benefits of marijuana, but does the science stack up? First, the defense. In the short term, weed seems to have this one because it suppresses physical arousal and promotes the creation of the neurological chemical adenosine. Weed can make the user feel pleasantly sleepy, though CBD is by far a more active part of the process than THC. Short-term weed use is believed to allow the user to spend more time in deep sleep, which will leave them feeling more refreshed when they wake up. However, this comes at the cost of spending less time in REM, or rapid eye movement sleep. This is the part of the sleep cycle where the brain processes emotions, encodes your memories, and allows you to dream. This is a huge benefit to people who take weed to alleviate their PTSD symptoms, as this will reduce the time they spend experiencing nightmares and stop their traumatic memories from being cemented too deeply into their minds. Some have even reported that using synthetic cannabis medication has reduced both nightmares and daytime flashbacks. However, there's a reason we stressed "in the short term" earlier. The prosecution can argue that long-term cannabis use actually makes sleep harder, as the body can become accustomed to weed's sedative effects, meaning that the person is forced to either take more or stronger cannabis strains in order to achieve the same effects. In turn, this could lead to side effects like less overall sleep, less time in deep sleep, longer time to falling asleep, and frequent nighttime wakings. High doses of THC before bed can also lead to side effects the next day, including lapses in memory and sleepiness. And if you decide to stop taking cannabis after a long period of doing so, you might experience cannabis withdrawals, which ironically can cause both insomnia and strange dreams, bringing you right back to square one. If you're an aspiring athlete, the science says that taking up habitual weed smoking probably isn't the best interest of your career aspirations, and for more reasons than the extremely frequent drug testing in the athletic field. Long-term marijuana use has been linked with a decrease in reflexes and reaction times, as well as physical coordination, owing to weed's depressant effect on the cerebellum and the basal ganglia. For that very same reason, you shouldn't even think about driving while under the influence of weed. Not only is it illegal, but your impaired judgment and motor control will also make it incredibly dangerous. So that's a strong point in favor of the prosecution. One of the most critical areas for discussion of the benefits versus drawbacks of smoking weed is pain management. A considerable number of medical or even self-medicating cannabis users do so to mitigate chronic pain, and it's often touted as one of the significant benefits of marijuana use. So do these claims hold up to scrutiny? Much like how cannabinoids alter the function of the reward pathways in our brain, they do similar things to the brain's processing of pain. It's why marijuana and CBD have been useful for people self-medicating against the effects of conditions like fibromyalgia, endometriosis, and chronic migraines. And any way you slice it, cannabis is undeniably a less risky form of pain relief than opioids, which pose both a greater risk of overdose and developing addiction. In addition to its effects on chronic pain, weed has often been praised for its anti-inflammatory properties. Studies have found that by targeting A3 glycine receptors, cannabinoids have been effective in treating inflammatory bowel diseases like Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, irritable bowel syndrome, and even some severe autoimmune disorders like rheumatoid arthritis. Decreasing inflammation in the body also benefits general health, so there's no complaints here. If you suffer from glaucoma, where vision is lost due to an increase in intraocular pressure on the optic nerve, weed has also been shown to reduce the severity of symptoms, and it's been a cause for medical marijuana usage for quite some time. Studies have shown that smoking weed can also be helpful in mitigating the worst effects of a number of serious diseases. One of the most prominent ones is multiple sclerosis, MS, an autoimmune disease that corrodes the insulating covers of the nerve cells and slowly debilitates the sufferer. There's an oral cannabinoid spray called Sativex that has been approved for treating multiple sclerosis spasticity in 25 different countries, and it's been found to relieve stiffness and spasming in adult patients who haven't been responding to other treatments. However, in some cases, this has been shown to have the side effect of inducing depressive episodes in patients. So like with many medications, its use is best judged on a case-by-case basis to achieve the optimum results. Weed's tendency to counteract spasticity has also made it a useful tool for epilepsy patients looking to mitigate their seizures. Specifically, cannabinoid medication has been shown to be effective against two specific subtypes of epilepsy: Lennox-Gastaut syndrome and Dravet syndrome. But we're not just talking about treating epilepsy with a blunt. CBD, the other active ingredient in cannabis aside from THC, has been shown to have the most beneficial effects. That's why the cannabinoid in question, Epidiolex, is a highly purified form of CBD. This, however, doesn't come without side effects, including liver damage and suicidal ideation. Once again, there are no silver bullet miracle cures here. Something rarely discussed about weed use is its negative effect on cardiovascular health in those who already suffer from heart disease. Because of weed's tendency to raise the heart rate, dilate blood vessels, and make the heart pump harder, which is incidentally why you feel your heart pounding in your chest while undergoing a weed-induced panic attack. Because of these effects on the heart, people with heart issues are likely to experience greater chest pains if they're also habitual cannabis smokers. In some edge cases, there have been links drawn between marijuana use and increased risks of heart attack, especially among those who are already predisposed to heart attacks due to pre-existing conditions. Cannabis use is definitely more problematic among certain high-risk groups, including all the ones we discussed before, and of course, children and pregnant women. For pregnant women, the risk posed is mainly to the healthy development of the fetus. Strains of cannabis with THC can even damage a baby's development from breastfeeding from a habitual user. Pregnant women who are habitual users of high THC marijuana are 2.3 times more likely to experience a stillbirth, according to some studies. Some reports have also indicated that pregnant mothers smoking marijuana leads to lower birth weights, much like regular tobacco use. Children of chronic marijuana users are also far more likely to experience developmental issues growing up. This brings us to the risks present in younger people smoking weed. Strains of high THC cannabis have been known to stunt the cognitive development of young users, impairing both attention and memory and leading to weaker work or school performance later in life. Some studies have even found premature marijuana use to be a risk factor for developing dependency in adulthood. And of course, a contentious point of argument for both sides. Cancer, the so-called emperor of maladies, killing almost 10 million people per year and ruining the lives of many more. Proponents of cannabis say that it can relieve some of cancer's worst effects. Critics will say it makes it worse. Let's take a look at the science. One thing we should probably get out of the way first is, no, smoking weed cannot cure cancer. That would be a pretty horrific oversimplification of cancer and weed's effects on it. While nobody should jump to conclusions on the human side of things here, there have been some extremely promising studies involving cannabinoid cancer treatments in animals. Some cannabinoid compounds have even successfully slowed the growth or even killed off cancer cells in petri dish tests. But again, these small successes in animals and lab conditions would still mean applying any of those advancements to humans would be years off if they came through at all. Regardless of any effects weed may or may not have on cancer itself, the science is in on some types of cannabis helping to relieve the worst kinds of chemotherapy side effects. The United States Food and Drug Administration has approved 2 different synthetic cannabinoids, dronabinol and nabilone, to take the edge off of the nausea and vomiting that's often caused by chemotherapy treatment. For some undergoing chemotherapy, there's an even more unpleasant side effect: peripheral neuropathy, a form of nerve damage that affects the nerves outside of the brain and the spinal column. It can result in tingling, burning sensations, numbness, weakness, and cramps in the hands and feet. Some studies have shown that smoking or vaping weed is able to ease neuropathic pain in chemotherapy patients, so it is a common form of self-medication. Studies have also shown that weed can counteract the appetite suppressant effects experienced by some chemotherapy patients, as well as people suffering from HIV and AIDS. Normally, people find the appetite increase caused by weed to be a detrimental effect, but for some people experiencing dangerous weight loss as a result of their illness or treatment for their illness, it is a godsend. The American Cancer Society has urged further research into the relationship between cannabinoids and cancer treatment, seeing as doctors and scientists are always looking to add new potential weapons to their arsenal in the seemingly endless fight against cancer. But we know what the prosecution is thinking. Can weed cause cancer? Of course, smoking weed, while not as dangerous to the lungs as tobacco smoking, is still smoking, and the lungs aren't designed to take in anything other than air. Smoking weed habitually has been shown to increase the risk of bronchitis and even lung cancer. There's even been some pretty limited research that drew a conclusion between chronic weed usage and non-seminoma-type testicular cancer, which is far from overwhelming, but still probably worth taking into account if you're the kind of person who inhales as much weed as oxygen on a daily basis. The evidence is in, and now it's time for you to make your verdict. People of the jury, is weed a blessing, a curse, or something in between? Amidst threats from Russia's President Vladimir Putin, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services made a purchase that immediately had many eyebrows raising in concern. On October 4, 2022, the HHS announced that it had purchased $290 million worth of the drug Inplate from Agmin USA Incorporated, does the US government know something the rest of the world doesn't? Vladimir Putin's threats to use nuclear weapons have been met with global condemnation, but only one country has threatened to respond with, quote, deadly consequences, end quote, should Putin move to make that fateful decision. The United States is committed to punishing Russia should it make use of even low-yield nuclear weapons in its failing war inside Ukraine. President Joe Biden, his cabinet, and the Department of Defense have all refused to answer questions on exactly what this response would be, leaving the world to guess as to what the US may have planned. It's extremely unlikely that the response would be a similar nuclear attack, as the United States is committed to only using nuclear weapons in defense of itself, its allies, and those nations it has extended its nuclear umbrella to. These nations may not be formal allies of the United States, but are considered U.S. soil when it comes to the use of nuclear weapons, and a nuclear attack on them is considered a nuclear attack on America itself. This not only helps reassure nations around the world, but is meant to deter them from building their own nuclear weapons programs, thus ensuring non-proliferation of these deadly weapons. But there is one other scenario where the US has reserved the right to use nuclear weapons, and that's in a first strike capacity. This doctrine is meant to discourage other nations from taking escalatory measures, including the use of alternative weapons of mass destruction such as biological or chemical weapons, by guaranteeing a nuclear response from America. Though this is only in extreme circumstances, so the United States nuclear doctrine does not extend to the issue of Ukraine. What is certain is that a response from the US to Putin's use of nukes in Ukraine will be an economic one, with America and its friends and allies leveraging their considerable political clout to completely remove Russia from the world economy. This would turn Russia into a hermit kingdom overnight, and as devastating as it would be, this wouldn't lead to nuclear war, and doesn't explain why the Department of Health and Human Services bought almost $300 million worth of medicine to use in case of a nuclear attack. That's where the second likely response by the United States comes into play, because the use of nuclear weapons inside Ukraine by Russia is all but certain to at last bring the United States into the fight. Former director of the CIA and commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, David Petraeus, hypothesized that a U.S. response to the use of nukes by Russia would include an overwhelming conventional attack against every Russian position inside Ukraine. This would likely involve NATO partners and be carried out via a massive air campaign launched from NATO bases in the heart of Europe. The United States has already pre-positioned B-52s in Europe, capable of bringing apocalyptic levels of firepower raining down on the heads of Russian personnel. And multiple air wings of U.S. air superiority fighters are permanently based across various American military bases in Europe. Under pressure from Ukrainian forces, Russian forces would quickly collapse under the weight of American air power. Even accounting for inevitable losses from Russian air defenses, U.S. stealth aircraft could also reach targets that Ukraine simply cannot, such as logistics hubs, lines of communication, and command and control nodes deep in the rear areas. Staging grounds in Crimea would certainly come under direct attack, and the Kerch Bridge, recently bombed, likely by the Ukrainians, would certainly be eliminated. Russia's dense S-400 and S-300 protective air defense network would be penetrated by stealth aircraft with low observable standoff attack munitions. But that's only the start of the U.S. response, as America would seek to brutally punish Russia for the use of nuclear weapons. As Russian forces are under attack on land, the Russian Black Sea Fleet would have its days numbered. A high priority for the U.S., Russia's Black Sea Fleet threatens Ukraine's trade routes due to its ability to block off ports along the southern coast of the country. It was also this fleet that made it impossible for Ukraine to ship its grain internationally, threatening a global food crisis. Now, NATO-supplied ground-based anti-ship weapon systems have given Ukraine some capability to keep Russian ships off their shores, but ultimately most of its merchant ships are unable to leave Ukraine due to the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The destruction of the Russian Black Sea Fleet would be a crippling blow to Russia's ability to project power in the area, but it would also have a massive financial cost as well. U.S. LRASMs, or long-range anti-ship missiles, are the world's first stealth anti-ship missile, a very low observable weapon designed to penetrate very dense air defense networks and deliver a 1,000-pound warhead to a ship. A single blow from an LRASM can be enough to sink smaller to medium-sized vessels, such as a destroyer, if it hits it in the right place. With billions of dollars of hardware sent to the bottom of the Black Sea, Russia would not only take a massive military hit, but a financial one as well. And all that hardware would take decades to replace after tallying the effects of the current and future sanctions alongside a shrinking economy. There's no question that a U.S. response would be devastating for Russian forces, but perhaps that's exactly why the Department of Health and Human Services has proactively bought nearly $300 million in drugs designed to fight radiation sickness. Suffering such an overwhelming and humiliating defeat, Vladimir Putin would have two options: admit defeat and end the war, or escalate further with nuclear attacks against the US. There's no evidence that Russia is actually moving to use nuclear weapons, and it's unknown if the DHHS is buying these drugs in response to any expected attack. What is known is that the purchase was undertaken under the authority of the 2004 Project BioShield Act, which was meant to better prepare the US against nuclear, chemical, or biological attack. Nplate is used for both adults and children to treat extreme blood loss that occurs after severe radiation exposure. Because radiation can destroy blood platelets, small wounds can lead to huge bleeds, endangering lives. Nplate stimulates the body's natural ability to build platelets, so as to rebuild the ability to clot blood and thus avoid bleedouts. It's not known exactly how many doses were bought, but it does not seem as if they were purchased to send to Ukraine in case of an escalation by Putin. Rather, this seems to be part of the DHHS's plan to keep a steady resupply of emergency medications at constant readiness. Because drugs like these often have a limited shelf life, the agency regularly buys drugs to replace those which are soon to expire, giving the soon-to-be expired drugs back to the manufacturer to quickly sell on the marketplace. This makes procurement costs cheaper for the government and ensures a ready supply in case of emergency. The Department of Health and Human Services may simply be further enhancing its preparedness for a disaster, but the timing is very suspicious. What this means about the future of the Ukrainian conflict is unknown, but as the war drags on and Russian losses mount, the consequences of the war might end up with global and possibly even world-ending repercussions. Today we're diving into a hot topic in the world of cannabis: smoking weed versus eating it. We've all heard about those methods, but what exactly sets them apart? From how quickly they hit you to their effects on the body, there's a lot to unpack. As we delve deeper into the topic, it's important to understand that the way our bodies process cannabis can significantly alter our experiences with it. Smoking and eating weed aren't just different in terms of consumption methods, they engage with our biology in distinct ways. Whether you're a seasoned smoker or just cannabis curious, knowing these differences is key to making informed choices about your consumption. First, meet Sarah. Sarah's in her late 20s and works as a graphic designer in a bustling city. She's always been open-minded and curious about different experiences, including the world of cannabis. Sarah's exposure to weed has primarily been through social gatherings and occasional use, but her experiences have been limited to smoking, usually sparking a joint or hitting a bong. Lately, she's been hearing a lot about edibles from her friends and a few online forums, so she's intrigued. Sarah's journey into exploring the differences between smoking and eating cannabis begins with a visit to a local dispensary. When Sarah visits the local dispensary for the first time, she's both excited and a bit overwhelmed. The dispensary, with its wide variety of products and knowledgeable staff, offers a welcoming atmosphere for both newcomers and experienced users. Sarah takes her time to talk with the bud tenders who are eager to educate her about the different strains, THC and CBD content, and the effects of various products. They emphasize the importance of starting with low doses, especially with the edibles, and suggest trying a few different strains to understand which works best for her needs. Determining the quality of the dispensary is easy for Sarah. The clean, well-organized space, clear labeling, and transparency about product sourcing and testing give her confidence in her choices. She appreciates the dispensary's commitment to customer education and safety, which is evident in their detailed product descriptions and willingness to answer all of her questions. This visit not only provides Sarah with the products she's curious about, but also arms her with the knowledge and understanding necessary for a responsible and enjoyable cannabis experience. Sarah is still a bit apprehensive, but she's excited to learn more. Throughout our video, we'll check in on Sarah at key moments of her exploration. She'll be our guide through the real-world application of the facts we discuss. So let's tag along with Sarah as she embarks on this enlightening journey into the diverse world of cannabis consumption. Let's dive right into the speed and duration of the effects you experience. When you light up a joint and inhale, the sensation of calmness or bliss washes over you almost instantaneously, typically hitting within a few short minutes. The rapid onset of effects while smoking cannabis is a result of the efficient route THC takes from the lungs to the bloodstream. When you inhale cannabis smoke, the THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, the primary psychoactive compound in marijuana, is immediately absorbed by the alveoli in the lungs. The alveoli, tiny air sacs in the lungs, have a vast network of blood vessels or capillaries which are extremely efficient at absorbing oxygen, and in this case, THC, into the blood. Once the THC enters these capillaries, it quickly travels through the bloodstream and reaches the brain within seconds to minutes. The swift journey from the lungs to the brain is what leads to the almost immediate onset of effects when smoking cannabis. The blood-brain barrier, a protective layer around the brain's blood vessels, is easily penetrated by THC due to its lipid-soluble nature. Upon crossing the barrier, THC interacts with the endocannabinoid system in the brain, particularly binding to cannabinoid receptors, which results in the psychoactive effects commonly associated with cannabis use, such as euphoria, relaxation, altered sensory perception, and in some cases increased appetite. On the flip side, when you opt for edibles, patience is key. The journey from ingestion to feeling the effects is considerably longer, ranging from about 30 minutes to even a couple hours. This delay happens because the THC has to navigate through your entire digestive system, getting processed along the way before finally entering your bloodstream. But once the effects of edibles do start to surface, they come with a robust intensity and longevity that far surpasses smoking. Edibles are known for their sustained and powerful high, often lingering for several hours, providing a prolonged experience that can vary significantly in intensity and duration compared to smoking. In Sarah's first experiment, she decides to start with what she knows: smoking weed. She opts for a joint, as she's already familiar with the almost immediate effects that come with a few puffs. As she inhales, the THC travels directly to her bloodstream through her lungs, and within minutes she feels the familiar wave of relaxation and euphoria. This quick onset of effects is typical of smoking cannabis, as several studies have shown. It's a direct route to the bloodstream, ensuring the effects are felt rapidly. However, Sarah is curious about how this contrasts with edibles. A week later, she tries a THC-infused brownie. Remembering advice from the dispensary, she starts with a small dose. Unlike smoking, she doesn't feel the effects immediately. It takes about an hour and a half before she starts noticing a change, a delay caused by the THC needing to pass through her digestive system and then get metabolized in her liver. This slow onset is something many first-time edible users aren't prepared for, often leading to the common mistake of consuming too much too soon. What Sarah also notices is the difference in intensity. The high from edibles feels stronger and more body-oriented. This is due to the THC being converted to 11-hydroxy-THC in the liver, a metabolite that's more potent and has longer-lasting effects on the brain. This transformation is what often makes the experience of eating an edible more intense and prolonged compared to smoking. The duration of the high from edibles surprises Sarah. While the effects of smoking usually taper off after a couple hours, for her, the brownie keeps her in a prolonged state of relaxation and altered sensory perception for several hours. The difference in duration also impacts Sarah's day. After smoking, she's able to continue with her regular activities once the effects wear off. But with the edible, she finds herself needing to clear her schedule for the rest of the day, as the intensity and duration of the high are more than she anticipated. There are three main takeaways from Sarah's first edible experiment. One is to start low and go slow, the golden rule of edibles. Starting with a small dose, about 5 to 10 milligrams of THC, is key. Sarah now understands that the effects of edibles can sneak up on you, and overdoing it is easier than one might think. So she patiently waits for at least 2 hours to fully feel the effects before even considering taking more. This approach not only helps her avoid an uncomfortably intense high, but also allows her to understand how her body reacts to different dosages. Another key tip Sarah picks up is the importance of not consuming edibles on an empty stomach. Before indulging in her THC-infused treat, she makes sure to eat a balanced meal. She learns that having food in her stomach, especially healthy fats, can aid in the more gradual absorption of THC, leading to a smoother experience with fewer spikes in intensity. This approach helps mitigate the potential of an overly intense high and aids in stabilizing the effects over a longer period. Sarah finds that eating a meal before she takes her edible not only enhances her overall experience, but also helps her in maintaining her comfort and well-being throughout the high. Sarah also realizes the setting and the environment are key when trying edibles for the first time. She chooses a comfortable, familiar place where she feels safe and relaxed. She makes sure she doesn't have any pressing tasks or responsibilities for the next few hours, as she's seen firsthand that the effects of edibles can last much longer than smoking. Sarah also keeps herself hydrated and has some snacks on hand just in case she needs them. By creating a calm and controlled environment, she ensures her first experience with edibles is as pleasant and stress-free as possible. When it comes to managing the intensity and dosage of cannabis, the approach varies significantly between smoking and consuming edibles. For smoking, the control over dosage is much more straightforward. The immediate onset of the effects when THC is inhaled allows users to gauge how much they've consumed quite quickly. Typically, a standard dose for smoking might be a few puffs for a casual user, with each puff delivering a relatively known quantity of THC. This immediate feedback loop enables users to stop at the point where they feel comfortable, minimizing their risk of overconsumption.
When defining a standard dose for smoking marijuana, the quantity of THC in each puff can vary based on the device or method used. So let's look at a few examples. First, let's examine the joint, or a marijuana cigarette. A common choice for consuming cannabis, a joint typically contains about 0.3 to 0.5 grams of cannabis. For a casual user, a standard dose might be 1 or 2 puffs from a joint. Considering that an average joint has a THC concentration of around 10 to 20%, each puff could deliver a variable amount of THC, but it's generally a small and manageable dose for most users. Next, let's look at a pipe. Pipes offer a bit more control over the dosage, as users can load in a smaller amount of marijuana, typically around 0.2 to 0.3 grams per bowl. Each inhalation from a pipe can be considered a dose, with the THC content depending on the strain and the quality of the marijuana. What about those much talked about bong rips? Bongs are known for their ability to cool and filter smoke, providing a smoother experience. A single hit from a bong can be quite potent, as the chamber allows for a larger volume of smoke to be inhaled. For the casual user, one hit from a bong could be enough, especially if the marijuana used has a high THC content. Next, there's the vaporizer, not to be confused with a vape or an e-cigarette. Vaporizing cannabis is seen as a more efficient method of inhalation. Vaporizers work in a similar way to an oven, heating up the cannabis to just below burning temperature, but enough for cannabinoids to be released. This process is much healthier than burning and inhaling cannabis, as it reduces the amount of harmful byproducts you inhale. The dosage from a vaporizer can be more precise, as many devices allow for temperature control and metered dosing. A few inhalations from a vaporizer can be enough to deliver a standard dose, with each puff delivering a consistent amount of THC. With all that said, it's also important to note that the individual tolerance, the strain of marijuana, and the THC concentration massively influences how much THC is delivered with each method. New users should always start with a small amount and wait to understand how they react before consuming more. Now let's talk about edibles. These products present a wildly different challenge in dosage control. The effects of edibles are not immediately felt, since the THC must first pass through the digestive system. This delay can often lead to inadvertent overconsumption, as users might consume more thinking the initial dose wasn't enough. Standard dosages for edibles usually starts at 5 to 10 milligrams of THC. This is considered a low dose. Remember, when THC is ingested, it undergoes a transformation in the liver, converting to 11-hydroxy-THC, a compound that's more potent and crosses the blood-brain barrier more efficiently than THC, so don't be tricked by edibles that seem to have a lower THC content. The potency and prolonged effects of edibles can be attributed to both the conversion process in the liver and the sustained release of the THC into the bloodstream during digestion. It's crucial for users, especially those new to edibles, to adhere to that "start low and go slow" mantra Sarah learned from her pot brownie. Understanding those nuances in dosage and the body's metabolic response is key to a safe and enjoyable cannabis experience, whether you continue to smoke it or consume it in edible form. As Sarah continues her exploration, she becomes more aware of the challenges in controlling the dosage with edibles. She recalls how easy it was to take one hit at a time when smoking, gauging how she felt before deciding whether to continue. However, with edibles, Sarah quickly realizes it's a different ballgame. After her first experience with a longer-lasting high, she understands why dosage control with edibles is more complicated. The delayed onset of effects with edibles means it's easy to consume too much before the initial dose takes effect. In her next experiment with edibles, Sarah decides to be more cautious. She cuts a small piece of a cannabis-infused cookie, mindful of the recommended dosage. She waits for 2 hours, resisting the urge to consume more, and finds that the smaller dose is more manageable and enjoyable. This practice of patience is crucial with edibles to avoid the discomfort of overconsumption. This approach leads Sarah to a better understanding of how different factors can influence the effects of edibles. She learns factors like her metabolic rate, the last time she ate, and even her body chemistry can affect how quickly and intensely she feels the effects of edibles. These variables make dosing with edibles less predictable compared to smoking, where the effects are more uniform and consistent. Now let's not forget about the health side of things. Smoking weed, like smoking anything, can irritate your lungs and throat. In the long term, this could lead to some respiratory issues, but edibles don't have this problem since there's no smoke involved. However, they do come with their own set of risks, like the chance of overconsumption we mentioned earlier. As Sarah delves deeper into her cannabis exploration, she becomes increasingly mindful of the health implications associated with different methods of consumption. Her experiences with smoking weed, while enjoyable, raise concerns about the potential respiratory issues. Sarah is aware that smoking in any form can lead to lung irritation and coughing. She recalls reading studies that suggest regular smoking of cannabis can lead to similar respiratory issues as tobacco, such as bronchitis or increased mucus production. This knowledge makes her more cautious about frequently choosing to smoke. Switching to edibles, Sarah notices an immediate difference in how her body reacts. Without the smoke entering her lungs, she doesn't experience the coughing or the throat irritation that sometimes comes after smoking. Edibles provide a smoke-free alternative, which from a respiratory standpoint feels like a healthier option for her. However, Sarah also learns that edibles come with their own set of health considerations. The delayed onset of effects and the potential of overconsumption can lead to an uncomfortable experience, often referred to as greening out, where a person who ate a bit too much of an edible might feel extreme anxiety, discomfort, or even nausea. Sarah's journey also leads her to consider the long-term cognitive effects of regular cannabis use. While research is ongoing on the subject, she understands that heavy and prolonged use, especially when started at a younger age, may be linked to certain cognitive impairments. This piece of information makes her more conscious of her consumption frequency and quantity, as she wants to ensure that she remains within a safe limit. In terms of digestive health, Sarah finds edibles do not negatively affect her. However, she learns that this might not be the case for everyone. For individuals with certain gastrointestinal conditions, ingesting cannabis can lead to different effects or discomforts. The way edibles are metabolized in the liver and the gastrointestinal system means they can interact differently with the body compared to inhaled cannabis. However, certain types of edibles are easier on the digestion system than others, depending largely on their composition and the individual's digestive health. Here are some factors to consider. What types of ingredients does the edible contain? Turns out edibles made with fewer and simpler ingredients tend to be easier to digest. Products that avoid complex, heavy, or overly processed ingredients will generally be gentler on the stomach. High-fat foods can slow digestion and may cause discomfort, especially for those with certain digestive issues. Edibles with a lower fat content, like low-fat gummies or hard candies, can be easier on the digestive system compared to rich, buttery baked goods. For individuals with gluten sensitivity or celiac disease, gluten-free edibles are a must. Similarly, vegan edibles avoid dairy and animal products, which can be beneficial for those with lactose intolerance or certain dietary restrictions. Tinctures or oils are also excellent alternatives. These alternatives can be easier to digest, as they're often taken sublingually, meaning under your tongue, allowing for absorption directly into the bloodstream without going through the digestive process. Edibles that incorporate dietary fiber, often known simply as high-fiber edibles, can aid in digestion. Fiber helps regulate the digestive system, but it's important to consume fiber within your dietary limits, as too much can cause bloating or discomfort. Finally, for those sensitive to THC or its psychoactive effects, CBD-dominant edibles might offer a gentler alternative. CBD is known for its calming effects and is less likely to cause the digestive upset sometimes associated with high doses of THC. It's important for individuals to consider their own digestive health and dietary restrictions when choosing edibles. Starting with a small dose to gauge how your body reacts is always a good practice. If you have specific digestive concerns or dietary restrictions, consulting with a healthcare provider or a knowledgeable dispensary staff member can help guide your choices. Throughout her exploration, Sarah gains a comprehensive understanding of the health impacts of both smoking and eating cannabis. She realizes the importance of balancing her enjoyment with her health and well-being. This journey through different methods of cannabis consumption teaches her to be more attentive to her body's responses and to make informed choices based on both pleasures and the possible health implications of her cannabis use. So let's say cannabis is working well for you, like it is Sarah, and you're starting to think about long-term use. Well, regular and heavy use of cannabis, no matter the method, might be linked to some cognitive changes, especially if you start young. However, the research is still ongoing, so be sure to keep doing your due diligence on looking into the health effects of cannabis. In the weeks following her cannabis experimentation, Sarah begins to notice subtle differences in her cognitive functions depending on the method of consumption she chooses. When she smokes weed, the effects on her cognition are immediate but fleeting. She experiences a short-lived alteration in perception, a slight haziness that lifts as the high wears off. This immediate but short-term impact on her cognition is in line with the typical effects of smoking cannabis, as the THC is rapidly absorbed and then quickly metabolized. However, with edibles, Sarah observes a different cognitive trajectory. The prolonged and more intense high that comes with edibles leads to longer periods where she feels her cognitive abilities are slightly altered. She experiences more pronounced changes in her sensory perception and time awareness. This extended cognitive impact aligns with research indicating that the effects of edibles can last much longer, sometimes resulting in prolonged alterations in perception and cognitive function due to the longer-lasting presence of THC in the system. On the digestive front, Sarah's experience with edibles is relatively smooth, but she learns that this isn't the case for everyone. Remember, the process of digestion and liver metabolism of THC can vary significantly among individuals, affecting how one's body reacts to edibles. This variability is a crucial consideration for those exploring edibles, especially for the first time. Sarah also becomes aware of the potential for long-term cognitive effects with regular and heavy cannabis use. While the research is ongoing, studies suggest that persistent heavy use might be linked to long-term cognitive changes. This knowledge makes Sarah more mindful of her consumption habits, as she wants to ensure her use remains within safe and moderate limits to avoid any potential long-term cognitive risks. Throughout her journey, Sarah's understanding of the cognitive and digestive effects of smoking and eating weed deepens. She learns to respect the power of cannabis and the importance of being attentive to her body's responses. Her experiences with both methods of consumption highlight the need for responsible use and an awareness of the varying effects cannabis can have on different aspects of her mental and physical health. The contrast between smoking and eating cannabis is indeed stark, almost like comparing night and day, with each method offering a distinctively different experience. While smoking cannabis offers a more controlled social and cerebral high, edibles can transport you on a longer, more intense, and often introspective journey. This fundamental difference in experience is crucial for users to understand, as it can help inform not only the choice of consumption method, but also the setting and context in which cannabis is used. Whether opting for the immediate effects of smoking or the delayed but profound effects of edibles, understanding and respecting these differences ensures a safer, more enjoyable cannabis experience. As she continues to navigate her way through the experiences of smoking and eating cannabis, Sarah begins to appreciate the unique characteristics each method offers. When smoking, Sarah finds the experience to be more sociable and communal, especially when she's with friends. The act of passing around a joint and sharing the moment adds a social dimension to the experience, which she enjoys. The effects of smoking are more predictable for her, and she feels more in control, able to stop when she feels like she's reached her desired state. Conversely, Sarah's experience with edibles is markedly different. It's more of a solitary journey, introspective, and tends to be deeply personal. She finds the longer-lasting, more intense effects of edibles lend themselves to a reflective experience, often leading her to deeper thoughts or creative bursts. This is something many users report, a sense of profound introspection or heightened creativity when consuming edibles, likely due to the stronger and more prolonged psychoactive effects. Sarah also notices the difference in the physical sensations between the two methods. Smoking gives her an immediate head high, a lightness that feels centered around her mind and eyes. In contrast, edibles provide a more body-focused high, a deep sense of physical relaxation that seems to emanate from her core and spread outward. Through her exploration, Sarah gains a newfound respect for the diverse experiences that cannabis in its various forms can offer. She learns to choose her method of consumption based on the kind of experience she seeks, whether it's the social, controlled high of smoking or the introspective, prolonged journey of edibles. Her journey underscores the importance of understanding not just the physical and cognitive effects, but also the qualitative differences in the cannabis experience. Through Sarah's story, we've seen the importance of education and personal responsibility in cannabis use. Remember, everyone is different. When it comes to weed, it's about finding the right balance and method that suits your individual needs and preferences, all while being mindful of the potential health implications and cognitive effects. Heroin was first manufactured in 1898 by the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company of Germany and marketed as a treatment for tuberculosis, as well as a remedy for morphine addiction. Made from the resin of poppy flowers, other chemicals are added and it's then filtered and refined to become the street drug known as heroin. The average cost of a single dose of 0.1 grams of heroin is approximately $15 to $20 in the US, costing between $150 and $200 per day for an addict to support their habit. In this episode of the Infographics Show, we'll be exploring just how bad the drug is, as we find out, what does heroin do to your body? Before we answer that question, let's first look at how the drug is taken and how many heroin users exist in the US. Heroin is an opioid derivative, and an estimated 13.5 million people in the world take opioids, of which 9.2 million are heroin users. According to the National Drug Survey on Drug Use and Health in 2016, about 948,000 Americans reported using heroin in that year. with the greatest increases being in young adults aged 18 to 25. The number of people using heroin for the first time in 2016 was 170,000, which is nearly double the number of people from 10 years previous. British newspaper The Guardian reported that in 2017, according to a study based on a survey of almost 80,000 people, heroin use among American adults has increased almost five-fold in the last decade. Researchers found that just after the year 2000, 0.33% of adults reported having used heroin at some point in their life. 10 years later, it had risen to 1.6%, which equates to about 3.8 million Americans. There are more people in the US using heroin. There are more people that meet criteria for heroin addiction, and we are seeing increases in all different social strata, in different age groups, in both sexes, said Sylvia Martins, lead author of the research from Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health. And these figures may even be low, as it's likely that many heroin users simply don't take part in health surveys. When we think of heroin, we think needles, but heroin can be smoked, which is known as chasing the dragon, and depending on the purity of the drug and the preference of the user, it can also be snorted. If injected, heroin can be administered into a vein or muscle. Heroin addicts tend to inject the drug into a vein as the effects take hold faster. Shortly after taking heroin, users report that they can feel a rush of euphoria, dry mouth, and a warm flushing of the skin. There is relief from pain and anxiety. Arms and legs often feel unnaturally heavy. The body temperature increases, the mouth becomes parched, and people often feel nauseous and vomit. The heart rate slows or is irregular. Breathing will also slow down and a person goes into a dreamlike state, falling in and out of consciousness. All of these effects relate to taking a small amount of heroin. Depending on the tolerance level of the user, an addict will have a much higher tolerance and need more of the drug to feel the same effect. But effects on your body can ultimately be what leads to a deadly overdose. If too much heroin is taken, it can cause a person's brain to not receive enough blood, and the respiratory system can go from slow breathing to complete shutdown. What about the longer-term effects of taking heroin on a regular basis? Unfortunately, the news is not good. You can develop infections of the heart lining and valves, usually as a result of lack of sterile injection techniques. Approximately 70% to 80% of new hepatitis C infections in the US each year are the result of injection drug use. Kidney disease is prevalent among long-term users. Pulmonary complications, which are often infection-related, skin infections and abscesses are common. Oral health problems, including damaged teeth and swelling of the gums. Skin problems from scratching, and problems with sexual functioning. Heroin impacts your body and health in a myriad of negative ways in the long term. There's also the potential for permanent organ damage to the liver and kidneys, and brain damage from a lack of oxygen that occurs during overdoses. And chronic heroin users often have lung problems, including tuberculosis and pneumonia. One of the biggest issues with heroin is that it is highly addictive. Physical addiction to heroin means it's very tough to stop taking the drug as the body changes, putting the user through traumatic mental and physical side effects. A user who's been on the drug for some time will have a very high tolerance, making the withdrawal even trickier. When people are addicted to heroin and they try to stop using, they can experience extreme withdrawal symptoms from between 48 and 72 hours to even longer after stopping use. The symptoms can include extreme craving for the drug, restlessness, muscle and bone pain, and vomiting. It takes many adults several attempts to get off the drug, and many never do. Addiction recovery rates for popular 12-step groups such as Alcoholics Anonymous or AA may be as low as 5 to 10% according to Dr. Lance Dodds, the author of The Sober Truth, Debunking the Bad Science Behind 12-Step Programs and the Rehab Industry. So other than going cold turkey, which means to stop and withdraw suddenly and completely from the drug, often without support or checking into a rehab clinic, what other ways are there? In recent years, there's been a lot of research into alternative methods. We found an interesting article in the British newspaper The Guardian about a chap named Jay. Jay was smoking cigarettes and marijuana at the age of 12, snorting cocaine by 16, and by the time he turned 18, he was onto heroin and crack cocaine. Amazingly, he still went through university and managed to land a job as a banker in the City of London. But it didn't last long, with Jay's marriage, health, and life in general breaking down as he continued to take drugs. By that point, Jay was mostly taking heroin, following an unrelated stomach operation that left him addicted to painkillers before he got back onto heroin after the doctor stopped the prescription. Jay took the rehab route and checked into a $13,000 a week center in Thailand in 2016. He was clean for a while, but like many addicts, Jay relapsed. Then a friend told him about ibogaine, a drug from an obscure African plant that Jay's friend said would enable him to come off heroin without the lengthy, painful withdrawal and stay off. His friend said the drug would help Jay understand where his addictive behavior was coming from. It would invoke a spiritual experience, as if speaking to God. After a lot of online research and speaking to different doctors overseas, Jay eventually flew to South Africa to try the treatment. One Monday morning, he took a test dose of ibogaine. He swallowed a small capsule with a glass of water. An hour later, Jay felt like his withdrawals had disappeared. The next 12 to 18 hours were a blur, though he remembered one vivid dream. I could see a lady, almost like Mother Mary, shaking a finger at me. She was offering to take me to wherever she was going, and I was saying no, no, no. Jay flew back home, and in the 10 months since, he hasn't had a single relapse. He explained to the Guardian newspaper that he had developed a new sense of confidence, has a new job and girlfriend, and finally feels like a functioning member of society. With all the pain and uncertainty that surrounds heroin withdrawal, ibogaine sounds like a miracle cure. But there's a catch. At this stage, ibogaine is illegal in the US, France, Sweden, Denmark, Belgium, Poland, Croatia, and Switzerland, and is strongly restricted in the UK under the 2016 Psychoactive Substances Act. And Jay also experienced some possible side effects. Once he was back in England, he was rushed into the hospital and diagnosed with a congenital heart problem, something he said could have been exacerbated by taking ibogaine. In September last year, at an ibogaine conference in Vienna, 20 experts, including medical professionals, providers, or activists, gathered to increase awareness of the drug and to encourage more research in Europe. Whatever the answer, it's clear that heroin and other opioids are a big problem, and the epidemic is growing. In the US alone, deaths from opioids have been rising sharply for years, and drug overdoses already kill more Americans under the age of 50 than anything else. And nearly 500,000 people across America could die from opioids over the next decade. Today, we're diving headfirst into a topic that's often shrouded in mystery and controversy: the effects of ecstasy, also known as MDMA, on the body. To navigate this complex subject, we'll be following the story of Alex, a college student with a keen interest in music and festival culture. Alex, like many of his peers, finds himself curious about the rave scene's infamous association with ecstasy. He's heard about the euphoric highs and the communal bonding it purportedly offers, sparking his interest in trying it for the first time at an upcoming music festival. Alex is a biology major, so he's approaching this journey with a scientific curiosity. He's read about MDMA in his classes, learning about its classification and some basic effects. But he's aware that academic knowledge doesn't always translate to real-world experiences. As the festival approaches, Alex finds himself at a crossroads, weighing his scientific curiosity against the potential risks. This dichotomy forms the basis of our exploration today, understanding what happens to the body under the influence of ecstasy, not just from a textbook standpoint, but through the lens of real-life decisions and experiences. From the initial surge of euphoria to the potential long-term impacts, let's follow Alex's journey, providing a comprehensive view of ecstasy's effects. It's important to note that this video is for educational purposes only and does not endorse drug use. Our goal is to inform and provide insights into the physiological and psychological effects of MDMA, contributing to a more informed and health-conscious audience. So here's Alex at the festival as he takes his first dose of ecstasy. He's soon swept up in a wave of euphoria. It's like a switch has been flipped in his brain, turning up the colors and sounds of the world around him. His heightened sense of joy and increased sensory perception is due to the flood of serotonin that MDMA releases in the brain. Studies explain that MDMA causes a significant increase in serotonin, a neurotransmitter associated with feelings of happiness and well-being. For Alex, the music seems richer, the neon lights brighter, and the beat drops more intense. The whole atmosphere of the festival is more vibrant and alive. But ecstasy doesn't just amplify Alex's mood and senses. It also affects his social interactions. He feels an overwhelming sense of connection and empathy toward those around him, a common experience reported by MDMA users. Research in this area highlights MDMA's ability to break down social barriers, increase emotional warmth, and deepen the sense of connection with others. Alex finds himself more open, talkative, and emotionally available, feeling a bond with the festival crowd he's never felt before. However, it's important to remember that these intense feelings, though profound, are chemically induced and temporary. We must emphasize that while MDMA can create a feeling of euphoria and connectedness, it also alters the natural chemistry of your brain, which can have both short-term and long-term effects. This is something Alex and anyone considering using ecstasy should keep in mind. MDMA's impact on mood and perception is significant, but it comes with its own set of risks and consequences, which we'll keep exploring in Alex's journey. As Alex's night at the festival continues, he begins to notice an extraordinary surge in his energy and stamina. This is a typical response to MDMA, known for its stimulant properties. Alex finds himself dancing with seemingly endless energy. Multiple studies explain how MDMA increases adrenaline levels, which in turn boosts energy and reduces the sensation of fatigue. For Alex, it feels like he can dance for hours without getting tired, a stark contrast to his usual energy levels. However, his heightened energy and stamina come at a cost. MDMA's stimulant effects are not just about increased physical energy, they also put a strain on Alex's body, particularly his cardiovascular system. As he dances, his heart rate is higher than usual, a common effect of stimulants like MDMA. Research highlights this as a typical response, noting that increased heart rate and blood pressure are common physiological reactions to MDMA. This points to the hidden toll that substances like ecstasy can take, even when they make you feel invincible. As the festival goes on, Alex's perception of his physical limits becomes skewed. He feels like he can push his body much harder than he could under normal circumstances. This disconnect between his perceived and actual physical limits is a crucial aspect of MDMA's effects. It's a dangerous illusion, as the body's warning signs of fatigue and overheating are masked by the drug's stimulant properties. This is particularly risky in a festival setting, where prolonged dancing and crowded conditions can exacerbate the physical effects of MDMA. Alex's experience with increased energy and stamina while on MDMA is a double-edged sword. It allows him an exhilarating experience of seemingly boundless energy and endurance, but it also blinds him to the potential physical strain he's putting on his body. This is a vivid example of how MDMA can alter one's physical experiences and perceptions, underscoring the importance of being aware of the drug's potent effects on the body. As we continue to follow Alex's journey, we'll delve deeper into the more immediate and potentially dangerous physical reactions to MDMA. As the night progresses at the festival, Alex starts to feel an intense heat overwhelming him, a condition known as hyperthermia. This is not just the result of his vigorous dancing or the packed crowd. It's a direct consequence of how MDMA interferes with the body's ability to regulate temperature. Studies point out that MDMA can disrupt the thermoregulatory mechanisms, leading to a dangerous rise in body temperature. For Alex, this means that even though he feels like he's just getting warmed up, his body is actually overheating, a state that can have serious health implications if not properly addressed. Amidst the festival's euphoria, Alex's condition highlights a critical risk associated with MDMA use. As he dances non-stop, the combination of the drug's effects and the physical exertion puts him at a higher risk of heat stroke. The body's normal cooling mechanisms, such as sweating and vasodilation, are less effective under the influence of MDMA. This means that Alex and others like him might not realize just how much their body temperature has risen, leading to potentially life-threatening situations. Recognizing something's amiss, Alex decides to take a break and seeks a cooler area, a wise decision that likely helps his body recover from the rising temperature. This is an important reminder of the necessity of taking regular breaks and staying hydrated, especially in a high-energy, crowded environment like a music festival, even if you haven't taken MDMA. Alex's experience with hyperthermia serves as a crucial lesson on the importance of listening to your body and being aware of the environment you're in, especially when using substances like MDMA. Let's continue to follow Alex's story to see how MDMA affects bodily function. As he cools down and rehydrates, Alex confronts another common challenge associated with MDMA use: dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. Despite the cooler environment, Alex finds himself incredibly thirsty, a symptom often overlooked in the midst of MDMA's more immediate effects. Research explains that MDMA can significantly increase the risk of dehydration and electrolyte imbalance, particularly in settings like music festivals, where dancing and high temperatures compound the issue. However, Alex also learns that simply drinking water isn't always a straightforward solution. Excessive water intake, especially in response to MDMA-induced thirst, can lead to a dangerous condition known as hyponatremia, where the body's sodium levels become dangerously low. Alex understands now that managing his water intake carefully is crucial, balancing his body's needs without overcompensating. This delicate balance between dehydration And hyponatremia is a critical aspect of MDMA safety that Alex and many like him may not have been aware of. It's not just about drinking water, but also about understanding how MDMA affects the body's fluid regulation. As the festival night wears on, Alex begins to notice an increase in his heart rate and a rise in his blood pressure, common physiological responses to MDMA. These symptoms are not just due to the lively atmosphere and his physical activity, but are direct effects of the drug. Because MDMA acts as a stimulant, much like caffeine or amphetamines, it creates a cardiovascular response such as increased heart rate and blood pressure. For Alex, this revelation is a bit alarming. He's always considered himself healthy and hasn't anticipated this kind of stress on his heart. This happened because MDMA stimulates the release of norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter that plays a key role in the fight-or-flight response, thus increasing his heart rate and blood pressure. Studies explain how this can put a significant strain on the cardiovascular system, especially in a high-energy setting like a music festival. Alex's concern grows as he remembers a biology class where he learned about the long-term effects of repeated stimulant use on the heart. Prolonged or frequent use of drugs like MDMA can lead to more permanent changes in cardiovascular function. For someone like Alex, who enjoys an active lifestyle and values his health, this knowledge is a sobering reminder of the potential long-term consequences of MDMA use. As Alex takes a moment to sit down and catch his breath, he reflects on the importance of making informed choices about substance use. His experience at the festival, combined with his newfound understanding of MDMA's effects, leads him to a more cautious and thoughtful stance. This part of Alex's journey highlights the significance of understanding the immediate and long-term impacts of MDMA on the heart, providing a crucial perspective for anyone considering its use. It's a reminder that while the short-term effects may be appealing, they come with risks that should not be overlooked. As the festival continues, another effect of MDMA becomes apparent to Alex: a significant loss of appetite. Despite the long hours of dancing and the energy he's expended, he realizes he hasn't felt hungry at all. This suppression of appetite is a well-documented effect of MDMA. When MDMA, like other stimulants, activates the body's fight-or-flight response, it diverts energy away from non-essential functions like digestion. For Alex, this explains why, even after hours of physical activity, he does not feel the need to eat. However, Alex also understands the importance of nourishment, especially during a physically demanding event like a music festival. He recalls reading about the risks associated with not eating properly when using substances like MDMA. Research notes that neglecting to eat can exacerbate the physical strain caused by MDMA, potentially leading to weakness and fatigue once the drug's effects wear off. Deciding to be proactive, Alex makes an effort to eat, choosing light and easy-to-digest foods. While he still doesn't feel particularly hungry, he recognizes his body needs fuel to function properly. This action is in line with advice from nutritional experts, who recommend small nutrient-dense snacks in such situations to provide energy and help stabilize blood sugar levels. For Alex, this is a practical application of his understanding of MDMA's effects, balancing the drug's impact with the need to maintain his physical well-being. This part of Alex's story emphasizes the importance of holistic self-care when engaging in activities that involve substance use. It's a valuable lesson in not just understanding the pharmacological effects of a drug like MDMA, but also in recognizing how it can impact routine bodily functions like hunger. Alex's experience serves as a reminder that taking care of one's basic needs is crucial, especially in situations where normal bodily clues might be altered or suppressed. As the vibrant night at the festival unfolds, Alex encounters yet another physical effect of MDMA: jaw clenching and teeth grinding, medically known as bruxism. This involuntary reaction is quite common among ecstasy users. Alex notices he's been clenching his jaw more often and more intensely as the night progresses, caused by the drug's action on the central nervous system and heightened emotional states. For Alex, this new awareness is slightly unsettling as he realizes the involuntary nature of this physical response. The impact of bruxism isn't just discomfort. It can have longer-term effects on dental health. Alex remembers a conversation with a friend who mentioned experiencing dental issues after frequent MDMA use. Research confirms that repeated episodes of jaw clenching and teeth grinding can lead to dental wear, increased tooth sensitivity, and even damage to the jaw joints over time. For Alex, someone who's always taken pride in his smile, this knowledge is a cause for concern. In response to this realization, Alex tries to consciously relax his jaw and takes breaks from dancing to help reduce the tension. He chews on some gum, a common practice among MDMA users, as suggested in online forums and harm reduction guides. While it's a temporary solution, it helps alleviate the discomfort a bit. As the effects of MDMA begin to wane, Alex starts to experience a shift in his mental state, a common occurrence during the come-down phase.
He feels a growing sense of anxiety and a touch of paranoia, starkly contrasting the euphoria he felt earlier. This change is not unusual, as studies have shown that the after effects of MDMA can include heightened anxiety and mood swings. Research has shown how the depletion of serotonin levels post-MDMA use can lead to those negative emotional states. The come-down phase brings a new set of challenges for Alex. He finds himself grappling with feelings of unease and a sense of disconnect from the joyous connectedness he experienced earlier. This is a psychological reversal, illustrating the transient and artificial nature of the drug-induced euphoria. Alex recalls reading about the potential for mood disturbances and depressive symptoms in the days following MDMA use. Thankfully, he knows that these effects are temporary, albeit uncomfortable. As the festival comes to an end, the sun begins to rise, and Alex reflects on his experience. He realizes the importance of self-care during this come-down phase, knowing that rest, hydration, and a supportive environment are crucial for recovery. This period of introspection is crucial for Alex, as it reinforces the understanding that MDMA's effects are far-reaching, influencing not just the moments of peak experience, but also the subsequent hours and days. Alex recovers from his night at the festival. He starts to ponder about the potential long-term neurological impacts of MDMA use, something he's only briefly considered before. His curiosity leads him to delve into scientific research, where he discovers a study detailing how repeated MDMA use can lead to changes in brain structure and function. These changes are particularly evident in areas related to emotion, memory, and decision-making. For Alex, a student with aspirations for a career in science, this information is particularly striking. The realization that MDMA could potentially alter his brain's functioning in the long run gives him pause, making him reconsider the frequency and context of his drug use. One of the most concerning aspects Alex learns about is the potential for MDMA to cause neurotoxicity, a term he remembers from his neuroscience class. Neurotoxicity refers to the damage that certain substances can cause to the nervous system, and in the case of MDMA, this can lead to a reduction in serotonin transporters in the brain. Studies show that this reduction can have significant implications for mood regulation, cognitive function, and overall mental health. Alex begins to understand that while the immediate effects of MDMA may be appealing, they come with a hidden cost that might not be immediately apparent. Another aspect that Alex considers is the role of MDMA in potentially exacerbating or triggering mental health issues. He reads a research paper that discusses the link between MDMA use and the onset of psychiatric disorders in susceptible individuals. This risk, compounded by the drug's impact on brain chemistry, suggests a complex relationship between MDMA use and mental health. For Alex, this information is a crucial factor in his decision-making process regarding MDMA use, as he weighs the short-term experiences against potential long-term mental health implications. Remember, staying informed and making conscious choices are key to navigating these experiences safely and responsibly. Now check out what happens to your body when you do cocaine, or watch this video instead.